Please welcome to the stage, Bloomberg's Haslinda Amin.
Good afternoon and welcome back to our program. From navigating the global geopolitical landscape to exploring the next biggest opportunities in sports investing. Our next few sessions continue to examine topics dominating the global boardroom agenda. Let's begin.
Please welcome to the stage, Nir Bardea, CEO of Bridgewater, Dina Powell McCormick, Vice Chairman, President, and Global Head of Client Services of BDT and MSD Partners, for a conversation with Bloomberg's John Micklethwaite.
You didn't go in front, John.
Yes. I've already failed my first instruction to go in front of the seats. We're very lucky to have Dina and Nir here, and we're going to talk a lot about risk and the investment side. And as I think some of you heard, I had a long conversation about the geopolitics earlier with General Petraeus. And so we're largely going to leave that behind. But just to throw one question to Dina at the very front, given your history in the White House on this, on the Middle East. I mean, how much do you think that has affected what's happening with investors now?
Well, first, thank you for having us today, John. It's lovely to be with you. You know, I heard Ambassador Dennis Ross talking about the situation in the region recently, and he described a tension between two forces, an axis of resilience and an axis of resistance. And I thought that that was a really smart way to frame the situation. You have an axis of resilience today with a group of leaders who are talking about visions moving forward for the future of the region, a population under the age of 35, 80% of the GCC countries, and an enormous amount of capital to spend in diversifying away from natural resources into artificial intelligence, green tech, biotech, et cetera. And also a little bit of hope in that it was only a few years ago that there were 4 countries that made peace with Israel in the Abraham Accords. And one of the things that I think is not as talked about today is the fact that those accords really brought those countries closely together. And not one of those countries has left the normalization agreements that they made, even after October 7th. And I think that's really important. I also think it's a function of the ties that now are binding them with trade, economic development, and diplomatic and security relationships. So the other side of the aisle, if you will, the axis of resistance is Iran and the proxies that it's funding and the terrorism that it's fueling all around the region. And I think the big question is what's going to happen in that tension. And I think investors are looking at that today. They want to be hopeful that resilience wins, but I think there's a big question mark.
It's interesting, isn't it? I'll bring Nir in on this. You have all these things happening in the world. You talked about in the Middle East, but you also have, even today, you have China announcing it's going to retaliate against America about tariffs. And people like me who spent their whole lives warning people like you, who strangely got richer all the time, that eventually kind of geopolitics would matter. Geopolitics seems to be everywhere at the moment, especially the idea of US versus China. But from an investor's point of view, investors seem to be just keep going. How do you explain that?
Yeah, well, let me step back. First of all, great to be here, and also meaningful for me personally to be here today. If I'll just step back for a second, because I think you're right, geopolitics is one of those things that is changing, but it's one of the things that are changing. And as investors, and as humans, we have this tendency to look at what we've just experienced and just extrapolate that forward. Just say, you know, what we just knew is the normal, and we can just extrapolate that forward, and that's the thing that's going to keep happening. When you look at the last, let's call it 15 years, the stars have aligned for investors. I mean, it's been a tremendous period for investors. If you kind of go back all the way from post-financial crisis, asset prices are low, tons of liquidity, then met with zero interest rates, zero inflation, and like you're saying, geopolitical, secular conditions are also disinflationary, and just a very long run that we have a blip in COVID, we get a hit, but then again, a lot of liquidity, we get flooded again, and fiscal and monetary and jubilee, and it's pretty incredible. You look at that 15-year period, and if you take US equities as an example, US equities in that time period returns 2-3x compared to any other decade for investors. And now we're sitting here and you have to ask yourself, going back to your question, are things changing or are they the same? What should we prepare for going forward? And a lot of people have a lot of views. That's what investors do. They have differentiated views. But if you just take stock of what's happening right now, so right now asset prices are a lot higher and interest rates are higher in a way that there's a hurdle rate for investors to kind of make decisions. The backdrop of geopolitics, like you're saying, has changed. It went from being disinflationary to much more inflationary. Tariffs, what happens if Trump gets elected, what you just mentioned about investments in green energy, investments in AI. You look forward, and yes, geopolitics is one of the things that have changed, but a lot looks very, very different going forward. And my advice to investors here is don't use the playbook for the last 10, 15 years for the next 10, 15 years.
But that's an interesting thing is that over the last bit, and bring Dina on this, in the world that has happened over the last few years, you would have thought that investors would have said, help, there is such a thing as inflation. Help, there is, geopolitics is there. You've got things which possibly even when you were in the White House, you didn't imagine happening, and yet still they push. What do you think, Dina?
Well, I think it's interesting because obviously there's a U.S. election coming up, and there's going to be, in some ways, a lot of change, possibly or not. And I think this morning, one of the interesting things that happened when the Biden administration announced the new tariff regime is that it's just putting kind of another affirmation on what will be tension between the U.S. and China. So I think as much as things are changing, there's a few things that I think you can count on probably being the same right now. In particular, they may have different approaches, but the same sense. It's very politically potent right now for both sides to talk about this issue. I thought it was interesting that the Biden administration didn't do the broad sweeping tariff approach that Trump is proposing. They really focused $18 billion of imported goods in the sectors that are most governed by the national security principles, whether it's AI, the semiconductor, steel, aluminum. And so I think the headline is, this is here to stay, and this is something that I actually see our investors and clients starting to recognize, that the US-China tension is going to remain, and they're going to have to start investing with that lens.
You just see the world breaking up into regional economies. You end up with an America's economy, you end up with a European one and an Asian one, a sort of Asia ex-China and Asia including China.
You know, what's been interesting over the last 4 years, and certainly after Putin attacked Ukraine, is there's strength, at least in the international organizations. They're, closing ranks in terms of allies with NATO and some of the international organizations. Economically, Nir made a really good point. We were getting more intertwined.
Yes.
And yet today, I think some of the military conflicts really do, put some people on different sides. Russia, China, and I think that's yet to play out for investors.
Now, when you talked about a new normal, and you sort of implied investors are out there, they still haven't moved enough to that idea that risk has fundamentally changed. What is the classic mistake that investors are making? In terms of asset classes or whatever, what is the thing when you sit down with an investor opposite, you may have some here, what is the classic sort of error they're making? Obviously, all your investors are brilliant, but allowing for that.
Correct, but so it kind of builds on what Dina said. I think humility and knowing that you're most likely going to be wrong about these big things, because I agree with everything Dina said. I mean, the world, we were globalizing. People optimize for supply chain. How can I cut 1% off of the? Now people are talking about resiliency. Now people talk about onshoring. People talk about, hey, how could I defend myself against? And we have this tendency to look at things like, by the way, AI could be a force in the other direction where scale matters and can actually bring people together. We tend to look at these things and think that we have a clue about how they're going to play out. And if any of you or any of us look back 10 years and say, how close were we? We were pretty far.
Yeah.
And look a decade before that, how close were we? We were pretty far. So the biggest mistake I think that investors make is they develop overconfidence. And our advice to our investors is, one, stare at your portfolio hard and make sure you understand it well. And what I mean by that is, if you just don't assume the next decade is going to be like the last one, what environments is your portfolio going to perform well in, and what is it not going to perform well in? And then stress test it. Literally say, hey, what if policy is going to stay tighter? What if inflation is going to remain higher? What if U.S. outperformance will not persist? What will happen with my portfolio? And then measure that against your goals, because every investor has specific goals in their portfolios. And close those gaps by doing one of three things, basically. Either shift your allocations, shift within your allocations, so you can stay allocated to equities in the same way, but choose the equities that perform more in the ways that you want relative to your goals, relative to how you stress your portfolios, and or create return streams that specifically address the problems that you are worried about. So you can hedge tail risk, you can do other things. That's what we do at Bridgewater. I mean, we spend a lot of time, including with clients here, talking to them about their portfolio, stress testing it, and then making sure that we create solutions at the total portfolio level to kind of
There's one really obvious thing that over all that period, one reason why people have done very well is if you simply bought 6 American tech stocks, and under your, just to push you on that, under your thing that the new normal won't be the same, that would imply, to me at least, that maybe those US tech stocks won't do as well over the next decade as they have over the past period.
Your big point, I could not agree with more.
Yeah.
This is what I meant in the beginning. The previous decade was like a straight flush for investors. You dropped, not just in the US, you dropped the dollar basically almost anywhere and you do well. And it could be US tech stocks, it could be other things. I agree that you should be open to a much wider range of outcomes and assume that you're going to be wrong. Even Bridgewater, we have 400 people spending day in and day out mapping cause-effect linkages in the world, and we still get 40% of our calls wrong.
Yeah.
So you have to acknowledge the fact that you're going to be wrong a lot and just make sure you're building a resilient portfolio, which you really didn't quite need in the previous decade, but you will need in the next decade.
Dina, do you agree with that? That it's spreading the next, there has been an easy option for the past period, that now it's going to get more difficult?
I think it depends on the investor, to be honest. At BDT and MSD Partners, we're really focused on a network of families and founders who think very long term. And really, I think the secret sauce is long-term aligned capital. And that presents opportunities. I'll give you an example. As much as the 6 or 7 big tech stocks and AI and the arms race and the learning applied models, our clients are very focused on what we call secondary opportunities. The opportunities that are going to build the platforms, the infrastructures, so that those new sectors can actually take off. What does that require? Long-term patient capital, unique partnership, trusted partnership, and advice. And I think that we're seeing, whether it's the servers or semiconductors, all sort of the nuts and bolts, if you will. You can't have AI without it, but you need a certain kind of capital and certain kind of partners that will stick with you as you're building that.
We're going to come back to kind of long-term view, and particularly this region in a second, but just the other big thing that has happened, very obviously, is that during this period, the amount of non-public companies that do, so much of capitalism. Our job at Bloomberg, I rather pompously say, is to chronicle capitalism, but so much capitalism is now taking place in the private markets. It's outside the range of the various indexes we follow. And I wonder how both of you try and deal with that. Nia, do you want to go first?
You go first.
I think that is, taken together with your point about the US, that is one of the questions that investors have to stare at. In this world where liquidity is not infinite, where there is a hurdle rate and investments have to justify themselves, I do think that staring at the allocations to non-liquids, staring at the allocation geographically to the US, are one of those things that could create outsized exposures and non-resilient portfolios. So I definitely agree. It depends on each investor, their goals, and where they currently stand, but it would definitely be one of those things that we would recommend people revisiting.
But do you think this is part of is this a permanent shift where we look forward? The past century, we've been used, when you measure capitalism, to look at public companies that everyone can invest in. Over the next period, it's actually going to be private capitalism that drives things.
I don't think anything is a permanent shift. I think history repeats itself over and over and over again. No, in that sense, I think the same mechanics, the same physics will work here going into the future again.
What about you, Dina? You've seen both sides, you could argue.
I've lived both sides,
Yes.
you could argue. Actually, I was talking to our CEO, Greg Lemkow, this morning about how to best articulate what this question of private versus public. And I think of it as the 3 Ps: private credit, private capital, and private industries. Private credit, we all know this is the age of private credit. It's obvious why. The large financial institutions have high cost of capital, regulatory burdens, so the financing markets have really tightened. And so I think that that's going to continue. And also, again, back to kind of the families and founders that we work with, it's also a great, income-producing mechanism. The second, private capital. Frankly, it's also less burdensome in many ways, and we've really focused on,
Yes.
co-investment opportunities. And then finally, private industry. And what I mean by that is the more public-facing, the more thorny an industry is that's going to require CFIUS approval or regulation, I think people are shying away from. I think it's just, again, you look at what happened this morning, I think there's just going to be higher regulatory burdens to get investments in those industries. And so I think you're going to see more what I call private industries that just don't require that kind of scrutiny.
Sort of going back to what I said at the beginning, is that maybe 10, 20 years ago, you could have had a company that just assumed the world was going to become more global, more similar, and that governments, both of us and all of us in different ways would have met people who said, Washington doesn't matter, this is all about how wonderful and free and unfettered my company is. Now, 2 ways. Firstly, Washington, or for that matter, Downing Street or the Elysee, can come and interrupt your business, but also it can give you a lot of money to go and do something, so that knowing about government has become more important. Do you think that's fair? I'm playing to your strengths, Dina. It's your CV.
Yeah, well, I think certainly investors are watching what governments around the world are doing. I heard Ken Griffin when he was on this stage earlier this week, and he was talking about the enormous deficit that we're facing, and frankly, it doesn't look like Washington is going to stop that spending anytime soon. I think that you look at the subcommittee on China that Chairman Gallagher put out a bunch of new policies, even potentially a reverse CFIUS. So even if you don't want to deal with government, you're likely to have to if you're investing in certain sectors, for sure. And I think whether or not it's true, I do think investors feel it. They feel a heavy regulatory burden, and frankly, are increasingly really worried about the size of the deficit. But that's also not politically popular. So you're not seeing Republicans or Democrats in the US talking about what it really means to attack that deficit and debt.
The experience from Britain, at least, is that people don't worry about these things until suddenly you have a Liz Truss moment, and then it becomes the most important thing. Sorry.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think governments matter more, period. On both sides, you kind of alluded to it in your question. We've learned things about fiscal easing post-COVID that are, I think these are lessons that are going to be carried forward. These are real things. And when we talk about tariffs or regulation, even what happens, who's going to nominate the next Fed chair if Trump wins the election, these are all things that make governments play a bigger role. It could be positive, it could be negative. It depends also on the eyes of who's looking at it. But I agree that trend is definitely picking up.
About inflation, we mentioned inflation at the beginning, and there'll be many people here who spend every second looking at dot plots and so on. Are you still scared by inflation?
Scared?
Yeah.
We're never scared by inflation, meaning I think this is normal. It just depends on where you were. But the idea that, yes, if you flood with liquidity and you spur up demand, especially if there's also a problem on the supply side, prices will change. That's the physics of how these things work. For a while, we kind of forgot it. So no, not afraid. And we think there's a way to go. We think this reality is here to stay. We started this year with 6 easings kind of priced in. Everybody thought, no, we're going back. We're going back to that world. And now we've seen the market correct. And we think that's going to be the dance. That's going to be the dance that the Fed and all of us are going to have to dance in the U.S. And by the way, when you look at that, also look at the divergences. We tend to talk a lot about the U.S., but the picture you see in Europe and other places is vastly different. It doesn't make sense to us, to Bridgewater. It didn't make sense there would be 6 easings. Still probably wouldn't make sense to us there would be any easings this year. But you look at Europe, you look at what Switzerland just did, different picture, and you see divergences in the world that are also interesting for investors who are looking for opportunities about how to deploy their capital.
Just quickly on that, do you, when you look at Europe, I mean, again, having just come from seeing Macron on Monday, his whole pitch is that Europe is sclerotic. It is not, it needs to reform itself dramatically. And I looked at the numbers, even France, which has done quite well since he became president, has grown half as fast as America. Is there any, do you see any sign in your world that is changing from the past decade to the next? Do you see any sign of a kind of rebirth in Europe?
So I would separate that to secular and cyclical.
Yeah.
So secular, I do think there's a lot of things that fundamentally need to be reformed in Europe. That's been talked about in Asia. But cyclically, I do think they are in a better spot. I mean, if the U.S., I believe, in order to slow inflation, will need actual restrictive policy. Like the reality is that to bring inflation down, you have to slow the economy.
Yes.
It's just the way it works. In Europe, they're past that point. They're much more ready at this point to ease.
Slowing the economy, I think we can agree Europeans are brilliant at it.
Yeah, they're very good. It's a talent.
It's something they can do without.
But at this point, they can actually stimulate. They are past that hump, and so in that sense, cyclically, there's room for optimism in Europe.
Dina, what about you? Just two things, just on Europe, but then maybe we could come on to the Middle East as well.
Well, you know, I just want to follow up on one thing Nir said. I completely agree with his view of monetary and fiscal policy, and the levers have almost all been used, and kind of we are where we are for the foreseeable future. I think it's interesting that if you look at any of the polls, you guys just recently did a bunch of polls, it's the #1 issue on voters' minds. And so I think that while it's talked about a lot, you know, again, from what, you know, the perspective of the Federal Reserve, I actually think it's going to be the deciding issue in the U.S. election. And I think that people feel it in a way that, you know, is stronger than it has been felt in the cost of goods, and yet the, you know, decreasing in wages. And so I think that that's going to be the big issue to watch in terms of, you know, economic policy. People think it's going to be national security or social issues. I think inflation is #1.
You would agree, presumably?
I mean, especially, I think economy is always a big, but I agree with everything Dina said, but especially because it leads to also the type of stuff that changes politics. So we talk about social inequality. Wealth is also incredible. I mean, one of the things that is leading to inflation is, you know, gold, Bitcoin. There's a lot of stuff that creates wealth that is certainly blooming in this environment of ample liquidity. So it's a subset of the population feels the inflation when they're going to the gas station, and a part of it feels incredibly wealthy. And so it's both what Dina's saying and the fact that it's kind of tearing society apart from a social inequality standpoint.
It is, and you were talking about, you know, what's happened in the last 10, 15 years and why that wealth gap has grown so much. I mean, people who had assets, well, you didn't have to be that smart. I mean, Bridgewater is, of course, uniquely smart. But you know, if you had assets, you know, your wealth and income rose, and if you didn't, you got, you know, really squeezed. And I think that's where you see the tension in that income inequality.
Can I come on to one last bit very quickly, which is this region? It's obviously, as you can see, this is a massive source of capital for financial firms to redeploy. But in terms of a target for investment, how do you see that? Maybe Dina, go first, and then.
You know, I'm bullish. I'm bullish because I've, over the last several years, worked on these issues, been in the region. I see the genuineness of the desire to move forward on the social, economic, and political reforms, although imperfectly, and certainly with some steps taken back. And frankly, it's in the U.S. national security interest that those reforms are completed, and for our allies as well. And so I think it's like a genie out of a bottle. I think once you get moving in that direction, it's hard to go back. And I actually think that it is very likely that And we know this, that the Saudis and Israelis were very close to normalization. And in some ways, there's a saying, don't waste a good crisis. And this horrific tragedy and crisis could actually be the final straw in between those two, axis of resilience and axis of resistance. And this crisis hopefully will lead to more countries joining the Abraham Accords and a path to peace and prosperity.
What about you, Nir? When you look at this region as a target for investment at the moment, are you?
I always say that incredible people, shared values, audacious goals lead to unbelievable outcomes. I'm from the Middle East, from a different part of the Middle East, and I'm in awe. I'm truly in awe of what's been happening in this region. And of course, I think everybody's watching and seeing the innovation, the ability to build incredible things, and capital will soon follow, because that's what capital does.
Do you see the ability to build incredible companies?
Absolutely.
And in terms of particular, obviously energy is, outside energy, do you see particular industries that you think will take off here?
Yeah, you already see the participation, again, out of the region in setting themselves up for the next tech wave. You see massive investments. It's a lot of the conversation we're having here today. That's taking the energy foundation and building on top of it and innovating. So I certainly see a bigger and bigger participation in the world economy in that way.
What about you, Dina? One last thing. Do you see?
Very much agree with Nir. Incredible human talent, enormous amount of capital that is very focused, I think, on the right sectors. But entrepreneurs, I meet them all the time here and throughout the region, and they're really innovating and creating, very interesting new economic, tracks. And I think, frankly, it's also interesting when you see how many women entrepreneurs throughout the region, an increase in women participating in the economy, but actually starting their own businesses. And so I think those positive forces are continuing to make investors see that it is an investable region for sure.
Well, we began with the pessimism of geopolitics, and we've ended up with a ray of light at the end. Thank you both very much for talking through.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nir. Thank you, Dina.
Please welcome to the stage Hassan Al-Thawadi, Secretary General, Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy of the State of Qatar, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Jennifer Zabazaja.
Your Excellency, Hassan.
Hello?
You told me I can call you Hassan, so I'll go with
please do. Please do. Your Excellency sounds awkward.
It's wonderful to be sitting here with you. And we were just talking. I can't believe it's been almost 2 years since the World Cup here. For you, who really was at the helm from the beginning, does it feel like it's been that long? Do you feel like it was just yesterday?
I still talk to people when they tell me about an incident that happened in 2023. I think it was a few months ago. So honestly, no. At times, time for me is just stopped to a certain extent in terms of measuring it from 2022. But at the same time, when you look back at everything that's been happening and all the kind of development, all the progress, and everything else that's been going on, it's a realization that wow, it's been a year and a half.
How are you measuring it? Would you say it was ultimately a success? Did it do what you had ultimately set out for this tournament to do here in Qatar?
I will try to say this with all the humility that I can say. So please forgive me. This is not in any way being too boastful, but absolutely yes. If you look back at 2009, 2010, and the promises that we made, whether it was in terms of the Compact World Cup and the benefits of a Compact World Cup, whether we talk about the accessibility of the tournament and the fact that it's accessible not only geographically, but even in terms of the system itself will allow for fans from different parts of the world to be able to attend and support their home teams, which normally would not be easily accessible for other tournaments. If you look in terms of what we said legacy-wise, how we're going to utilize this tournament as a catalyst for positive change, whether it's to upgrade the infrastructure development for the country that is in line with the country's overall development goals, whether it's in terms of some of the social changes that we saw the World Cup will be pioneering or at least pushing forward. It touched on all fronts. And then there's the one that I have to say all the time, because everybody says we were blessed with a fantastic final. And I say absolutely yes, we were blessed, but it was not pure luck. When we talked about the Compact World Cup, we always mentioned from day one the fact if you're located in one place, you don't have to travel from one place to another, from one destination to another. The players will be able to be well rested and well focused on where it matters, which is on the pitch and representing their national teams. And if you look at the history and the narrative of the tournament, if you look at the group stages, 2 group stages basically, up until the last 15 minutes of the final matches, you didn't know who was going to qualify, up until the last 15 minutes. Every confederation had a team represented in the round of 16, first time in FIFA's history. You had home nations, or you had Arab countries that were, basically Morocco was playing at home. It intimidated the Spaniards when it came to the penalties, that even Luis Enrique himself was kind of scared about it. And what I say is that was also well thought out. I'm not saying that we knew exactly the outcomes, but we created the environment for the ideal system, even when it came to the football.
Does that make all of the criticisms, the positives, the media buzz, I mean, all of the buildup leading up to 2022, does it make it all worth it? Because I'm sure many people have seen the documentary that you're featured in. This was a lot on you personally, professionally. I mean, for the country, was all of that endured in good faith ultimately?
Yes, it was definitely worth it. I mean, it was, on me personally, but also I look around, the room, and there's a lot of people that have been with me on the journey from day one, and have joined us also later on, and had to also endure a lot of the pressure that it's the only tournament that's had that much attention for such a prolonged period of time. I mean, if we compare, for example, today, 2026, Canada, Mexico, US, you hear about it, but it's not really front page news. We had to endure that, that interest and that focus for 13 years. But I think what it did as well is that it motivated us even further. It always, as motivated as we were, it always also put kind of very clear goals and clear objectives for us to be able to kind of achieve on a daily basis. And it led to, what I will say is, I think in my opinion, my humble opinion, the best tournament, best football tournament, at least the 32 version of the best football tournament, not only for Qatar, which is one of the most important elements that we've always said. This was a tournament for the Arab world. And it went even further, I think, in 2022, it went even further to not only be a representative of the Arab world, which was a great success, but it was also of the global South. The fact that you had people from Africa, from Senegal, from Cameroon, able to travel easily and represent and support their teams, and then after that, go and represent their culture in Surrogates, in Qatar. It was a cultural carnival of unprecedented nature, with everybody, most of the global South communities being represented. It was a great time.
How do you continue that positive change then? Because you mentioned the next World Cup, it is in the West. I mean, here in Qatar, what is it that's next? Because there was so much development that happened around these games. I mean, what can you do next with that?
Well, I think, again, you've definitely heard from the Minister of Tourism and from a lot of other people as well. We're continuing. Tourism is I think, the number one beneficiary. Tourism industry is the number one beneficiary of the World Cup. I believe in 2023 we had 4 million visitors, and the numbers keeps on increasing. We just recently hosted the Asian Football Championship, and again, record numbers not only in terms of attendance, but the nature of the fans as well. When the fans came, it was a celebratory event. It was our event. It was the Asian continent coming together and celebrating the event. And that in itself, I think, is a slight shift in terms of some of the Confederation events as well, that it kind of raises its profile. I won't say raises a profile, but it makes it much more celebratory and much more kind of tangible. So we're focusing a lot more on these events. Obviously, a big build-up on tourism. The infrastructure is ready, and the plans are coming ahead. And just today, I believe FIFA announced that we will be hosting the 3 future editions of the Arab Cup. And the Arab Cup was an idea that we had come up with. We had discussed with FIFA. It was our rehearsal, if you will, before the World Cup. So we hosted it in 2021. It was coming just off the end of COVID. So there was a lot of plans that we had to sit down and put in place and try to figure out how do we stress test our systems. But it also was a phenomenal celebration of the Arab world. And so I think that as a tournament in itself, coming and being here for the next three editions is just a further indication of the future plans that we've got in place.
When we talk about celebratory, the Olympics is a global celebratory event for many people. I mean, do you think Qatar could potentially host the Olympics one year?
Can we? Absolutely, I think we can.
Would
we? I'll leave that to other people who are more, the officials who are considering this matter. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, we've expressed our interest in this matter in terms of hosting the Olympics. But I think it's not just limited to major sporting events. I mean, I think what we're looking at today is expanding beyond major sporting events, and how do we create the events industry, if you will, to kind of support the tourism in terms of attracting tourists from outside to within. But at the same time, it's also how do we build on the operational knowledge and the know-how that we had from the World Cup, which today you see a lot of the benefits out of it coming into play. Today, for example, this event itself and this platform in itself, from everything that I've heard, the amount of demand and the amount of interest that's come from the region for this event itself it's been an exponential increase. And it's just one example of, I'm not saying the World Cup specifically is the cause of it, but I think all the lessons learned, everything that was developed throughout the 13 years to host a momentous tournament was always done with the intention of all that knowledge, all that infrastructure continues pushing the engine of progress and of development, which was always planned for.
Do you think the games like the Olympics could potentially benefit, just considering all these other benefits that you noted in terms of being in the global south, obviously being representing the region? I mean, could the games benefit potentially from being in the Gulf?
You mean, could the games themselves benefit, or could the games benefit us? Just to clarify that question.
Let's do both.
All right, well, I think the games benefiting, absolutely. I mean, look, if there was, I'm going to repeat this and I'm going to be harking up on it because I do believe in this. If there's one thing that the World Cup, at least for me personally, has indicated, it is the fact that, when you look at the celebration, when you look at the fact that people from all over the world came here, the World Cup came to the fans, as opposed to most other tournaments. Fans would go to the tournaments, and especially when I'm talking about the world from the global south. It kind of shifted, if you will, the focus and the compass towards the fact that there is a huge population that is fanatical about sports, that is also pays attention to the capabilities or the ability of sports to push the developmental goals for the nation if utilized correctly. And it's ready to host. And so I think there's no doubts that every nation that hosts the tournaments, provided that they approach it in the right way, provided that this event does not become the end-all and be-all of your objectives.
We have seen that happen before.
Well, we have seen that. That's the thing. And look, I mean, our success is based upon also lessons learned. I don't want to give what's it called, the negative examples, but there's been some very positive examples. Barcelona '92 is one perfect example of a successful tournament that launched the city of Barcelona into the global world in terms of being a destination. Provided you utilize the event in the right way, and again, it does not become that obsession that this event has to be perfect in all forms, regardless of any other consideration, I think the event will benefit the host nation. Now, whether the Olympics specifically, I'll give you my personal opinion. I think, yes, I think the sporting industry today is generally in the market. It's no longer competing with other sports. Today, I think the sporting industry is competing for people's attention. That's the marketplace today. Whether it's a specific sport, whether it's an event, or whether it's movies and entertainment. There's an evolution towards you're trying to capture people's attentions. And so at times you need to create the narrative and you need to create the connection with your fan base. So considering traditional markets is one thing, but there's a whole world out there that is ready to host, I think, and ready to utilize these events in the right way. But I think that consideration has to be made. And
you mentioned this briefly, but if not sports, are you looking to other entertainment sectors in order to be the hub for the Arab world?
Well, I think the Arab world generally, there's obviously a very big interest in terms of, like I said, the events industry.
Yeah.
Right, the events/entertainment industry. So there's a big focus today, whether it's Qatar, whether it's Emirates, whether it's Saudi today, you see a lot of big moves happening. For example, today Saudi, I have to say they're doing a phenomenal job when it comes to the boxing industry. I'm a very big boxing fan, and the boxing matches that they're making happen and they're hosting as well is an indication of kind of where I think the Middle East and the Arab world is putting a lot of shift. There's obviously entertainment. I have maybe a particular view personally for me in terms of the entertainment side, and especially when it comes to content creation, film, series, and so on. I'm very bullish in that regards. I mean, today if you see the Korean film industry, and I've been repeating this for a long time, if you see the Korean film industry today, it is a huge market, it is a huge export for Korea. It's made its inroads. Streaming services obviously have allowed for it and have supported it in terms of its growth, although that's been happening over generations and over years and years. People today go towards Korea to gain IP. The Arab world, 400 million people, extremely creative. Storytelling is part of our culture. If you go from Morocco all the way down towards the Gulf, storytelling is within our culture. We have a common language and common background, but at the same time, there's a diversity in terms of our cultures. And it's in that diversity that allows us to also touch base with other cultures throughout the world. I think, and yet still, we still don't have our Squid Games, we still don't have our Parasites, there's still the ability to translate our creativity and our creative content into a commercially successful, widely viewed project, or at least product.
Yeah.
I think now there's a big shift. There is a huge shift. There's a lot of investment happening. There's a big shift towards that. Because I think, one, obviously it allows us to tell our story to the outside world, but I think in the end as well, looking at the success that the Korean film industry has been able to benefit economically, as well as exporting the Korean culture, this is, I think, the next big shift and the next big push from our side.
What is some of that investment? Where is it going towards?
I think it's going in a number of different areas. I think partly, looking at some investment in terms of production houses, infrastructure development.
Locally?
Locally, regionally as well. I mean, and again, I also want to take a step back by saying, the film industry in particular, I don't want to kind of seem like it's nascent. Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, even, Kuwait, Saudi, Qatar. We're storytellers by nature. And in my opinion, some of the best, if you're going to ask for me personally, top 50 movies in history, there's at least 5 or 6 Arabic movies in there, easily. Top 15, actors and actresses in history. For me personally, there's at least 2 or 3 Arabs easily. So it's not something nascent, but I think it needs to kind of evolve to the next step. It needs to take the next step. So in terms of production houses, in terms of a bit of infrastructure, in terms of, I think, upgrading the capabilities when it comes to script writing, maybe some of the action scenes and so on, like stunt creation or stunt development, below the line, above the line kind of investments, and that's happening. You're seeing that happening today. There's a lot that's happening, and I think step by step you're going to see that. You're going to see, I think, in the next 5-6 years, a very big push when it comes to Arabic content.
Oh, wow. Where do you think there are still gaps? I mean, we touched on fashion. I mean, do you think that's potentially another opportunity for Qatar to step in?
Fashion, I mean, we've hosted our fashion houses or fashion events over here. I think, Arabic fashion is, there are some fashion designers out here. I'm not an expert in fashion, so I can't speak too much about it, so I apologize if I sound very, very naive, but I think, of course, absolutely. I mean, there's some phenomenal fashion designers. I think anything creative, when you look at the Arab world, and you look at Qatar in particular, I mean, if you look at, Qatar Creates in Msheirab, for example, I think we recently hosted the Christian Dior kind of legacy showcase. And it was a phenomenal representation, but I think it showcased, and it also we showcased a lot of young, up-and-coming fashion designers. And it's kind of trying to bring back the, the traditional, but with the young and new. And that's kind of coming gradually within a lot of the initiatives that Qatar Creates is doing as well.
But ultimately, it seems like the best return on investment is sports, for the World Cup. No,
I will say this. I think the best return on investment, you mean in terms of what creates the best return on investment? Look, it's the World Cup. The simple reality is, I'm going to take away from sports, it's the World Cup. It is the biggest sporting event in the world, regardless of anything else. I don't think it's still taken its full value yet. I mean, if you compare, for example, the Super Bowl, 30-second clip, $7 million versus, all the revenue that the World Cup makes up. Obviously, there's a big disparity, but it's the World Cup. It's the biggest sporting event in the world. So it is the biggest opportunity. And so it creates it's the biggest risk, and at the same time, it creates the biggest rewards. If you utilize it correctly, yes, the payback is quite satisfying and quite long-term. That's what we did.
The risk in terms of scrutiny?
Well, it's not just the scrutiny. I mean, it's the biggest event in the world, absolutely. Scrutiny, everybody's looking at you. We had a higher level of risk compared to everybody else because of the interest, because of the scrutiny and the focus, absolutely. But I think what it ended up doing was, again, as I said, the payback to all the people that thought from day one things were going to fall apart. I think what people saw was a great tournament. The Arab world, not just Qatar, but the Arab world hosting the rest of the world here. And it was a global cultural celebration where the global South took center stage. You know, apart from, of course, all the infrastructure that you get to experience and see, which was all part of the plan. But it's the World Cup. You know, I think every other sporting event or cultural event has its own unique payback period as well. You have to look at the risk profile and kind of what benefits you can get out of it and extract out of it. And you have to approach each one very, very, I think, surgically to kind of plan for the future.
And if that is the peak, personally, professionally, as you've noted, I mean, how do you top that? What do you do, not what do you do next, but what would you, what would you be interested in?
You build upon it. I mean, as I said, today we've hosted the Asian Cup, the most successful Asian edition of the Asian Cup. There's other sporting tournaments that are in place, but there's also a lot of other conferences and other events as well that are coming into play. You know, there are discussions in terms of, you know, focusing on a little bit more of the entertainment side of things, and I think the Minister of Tourism has mentioned it, Saad's mentioned it a number of different times. But also you look at, again, I don't want to underestimate the platforms such as these. Today, Bloomberg is a great platform, but I think there's opportunities to build even further on this platform. Web Summit was a great success. And I think if you look at the Web Summit in particular, it's if you will, the equivalent of the major sporting event comes to the people. Web Summit came to the people. It's a great event. People, all entrepreneurs, and especially initially techies, but all entrepreneurs yearn to go and want, you know, see it in Lisbon. And some people, you know, from South America had the opportunity to see it in certain places in Singapore. Today, people from the Middle East and Africa were able to come. And it's bringing these events. And you build upon them, obviously. There's a great demand. There's a great demand that in itself will unleash a lot of opportunities and a lot of potential. And the capability and the ability to be, you know, a world-class host is here, and we're just building on that. So, like I said, there's the Web Summit, the Bloomberg Doha Forum, at the end of the year. These are all conferences that I think will benefit and will build upon and become, you know, household names down the road.
And what about personally, just really quick?
Personally, what's the question? Personally,
how do you build off of the peak that was the World Cup?
Well, I think, first thing I have to come to realize that was the peak, in the sense of there's nothing that's ever going to be that intense. I have to come to terms with that. 13 years of intense work, 13 years of, you know, this World Cup becoming your obsession, daily in and out. I think I finally come to terms with it this year, by the way. That's why the time difference always, when people talk to me, it was 2023, you know, 2022 was last week. I think now I'm coming to terms with the fact that it'll never, but it's a very unique experience. I've got to come to terms with the fact that it's, you know, that is there. Now move on to the next passion. But the passion will never, as of now, will not necessarily equate to it. You know, when you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and at the time it was BlackBerries, looking at the red dot, knowing that you've got an email and you knowing it's from a certain entity, and you've got to respond within the next 12 hours, and then something's going on with the stadiums, and, you know, everything is moving along, and then, you know, lo and behold, COVID hits. That kind of drama, very difficult to follow.
Hopefully.
But there's good stuff to, not to say there's good stuff to come, you know, within the sports and entertainment sector.
Absolutely. Your Excellency, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage His Excellency Engineer Khalid Ahmed Al Ubaidli, President of the Public Authority for Regulating Real Estate of the State of Qatar, Jonathan Goldstein, CEO of Kane International, Cindy Lim, CEO of Infrastructure of Keppel Limited, and Stephen Witkoff, Founder, Chairman, and Co-CEO Witkoff, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Jemana Bursachi.
Right, let's get started. Our next panel is about taking cities to the next level, and I mean, I can't think of a more perfect place to be having this discussion. We were speaking off stage, and I was saying to the gentleman that I have only been to Qatar once, and that was in 2009, and things have really changed a lot since then. In fact, there are whole new cities where we are right now. Lusail didn't exist 10 years ago, and that is also testament, of course, to the vision of Qatar and how much activity, construction activity has happened just in the last decade. So to that effect, Your Excellency, I would like to start with you. And a question just really about how much construction real estate activity has taken place in the last decade. Of course, in the run-up to the World Cup, that was a major event which I think accelerated the timeline of a lot of these projects. Where we are right now in terms of the real estate infrastructure you have and how best to optimize it.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu salam ala Rasulullah. First of all, I would like to welcome you all, Jumana and Jonathan, Cindy, Steve, to Doha. And we are pleased to have you in Doha. Basically, as His Excellency the Prime Minister mentioned yesterday, and also at the session of His Excellency, the Minister of Finance, you know, we have accelerated all of the real estate infrastructure. We built a world-class real estate infrastructure. And now we are looking to activate those real estate infrastructure, attracting the right partners, the right talent, and mix it with our nationals in order for us to improve productivity of the sector and of our nationals.
What does the activation mean in practice? What is it that you're looking for?
Basically, we do have a world-class, you know, infrastructure built and expedited due to the catalyst of the World Cup. And now we are selective in attracting the right partnership and the right industries, something like, you know, data centers, warehousing, and just to look where really the next phase of infrastructure demand is, and utilize the current infrastructure to cater for the future demand.
And where does repurposing come into that also?
Sorry?
Repurposing.
Yeah, we are thinking about repurposing some of the infrastructure currently, and we will use the international partnership to advise and work with us to put to the best use the current infrastructure.
Jonathan, when you think about investing and building up your portfolio, what are some of the factors that you take into consideration?
Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you to His Excellency. And just to reiterate what a privilege it is to be in Doha and to be at the Economic Forum and to be able to say a few words. I think one of the things that I also first visited Doha in 2009, and I think one of the things that you see, the more and more time you spend within the region, is the benefits of long-term leadership and stability with a vision. And I think one of the great things that you want as an investor and that you're seeing within the Gulf area, in Qatar and also in the UAE, is this, and obviously in Saudi as well, you're seeing the benefits of this long-term vision. We heard yesterday about His Royal Highness's vision for 2030. And I think as an investor, when you're coming in, that is really what you want to understand. You want to understand the long-term vision. You want to see transparency. You want to see rule of law so that you have comfort that in your long-term investment. You know, one of the challenges that we see in some of the cities that we invest in the United States, we were early adopters in South Florida. And obviously everybody knows there's been a massive boom in South Florida through post the pandemic. We started investing in 2016, 2017, and just about to open one of the largest office blocks in Miami. But you see challenges that sometimes the local leadership and national leadership doesn't have the long-term vision to be able to achieve, to sustain that development. Those challenges may be in transport, they may be in education, they may be in social inclusion, they may be in sustainable design. There's many challenges that cities have to ensure that when they enjoy growth spurts, that the infrastructure keeps up with it. And one of the things you see when you look out the window in Doha, you see a vision and you see those challenges being thought about and I'm sure being overcome.
Yeah, you know, and you talk about the opportunity, but of course it doesn't exist in a silo. You have to think about the broader macro environment. And I just wonder, more generally speaking, what sort of environment this is for real estate investing. We talk about very high interest rates. We talk about, the difficulty of financing, liquidity issues. How is that also contributing to the outlook from here?
Well, I think that if you look at the region and its development over the last 20 years, obviously in order for investment to prosper, one needs volume, one needs population growth, but you need a vibrant economy. And you're seeing these things within the region. His Excellency will be able to tell me the exact numbers, but the population growth in Qatar over the last 20 years has been quite significant. So the more that you see this growth within areas, the more that fires investments and more that gives investors the protection. When we started CAIM, we believed in investing in gateway cities. It's no surprise that our largest development is in Los Angeles, in Beverly Hills. We've invested into Los Angeles, into New York, into Miami, because we believed in the underpinning stability of those gateway cities. So the more that the region can show that long-term stability and the growth, then you will see these gateway cities in the region becoming globally leading over the course of the next 20, 30 years. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
Cindy, His Excellency talked about not just real estate, but the real estate infrastructure that goes along with it as well. How important a factor is that?
The infrastructure-oriented development of real estate is going to power the next stage of growth for gateway cities. The reason is very simple. If you look at the real estate, it is easily 20 to 40% of carbon emission contributor worldwide. So when it comes to real estate, having sustainable infrastructure-oriented real estate development is key. First and foremost, how do we have sustainable waste management system, water treatment and distribution system, low carbon construction of mega development? Not only that, in the long-term operation and maintenance of the built environment, how do we drive energy efficiency? Not just using technology, but more importantly, shaping and influencing how the society view and use energy in their daily life, including down to having a very sustainable commitment towards use of resources, disposal and recycling of material and waste. This will involve also co-creation and co-innovation of ecosystem. So if you look at infrastructure and real estate, not just as a destination or as a venue, but also an enabler for people to come together to innovate, to drive social development, and to collect data, social data in terms of the usage and the impact that we are trying to drive. So the long-term planning, design, and engineering is very important.
I hear the word data collection and a little bell goes off in my head, artificial intelligence. So let me just ask you what potential uses you see for AI in infrastructure tech.
It's a very good question because back in Asia, in Singapore, for example, we are driving AI-based energy management system. So we have a digital twin of the built environment, not just the vertical real estate, but also the horizontal infrastructure, whereby when I say digital twin, we also sensorize key components of the built environment to collect data, correlate such data with weather, with actual live traffic flow, for example, and then use algorithm-based set point to drive the equipment, machineries, and devices. So this, over time, become very scientific and data-backed. If I fast-track the movie, most nations and businesses have set commitment for net zero by 2050. So if we start collecting the data, big data in particular, having AI-based decision-making, facts-based data set, this will help catalyze innovation and investment in the right area in the long term.
So potential, a lot of use cases there. Stephen, let me turn to you as a very experienced real estate investor. Maybe let's just start with how you are seeing the opportunity right now within the region.
Well, Qatar's a very, is really impressive. We were talking about it before. The land use and zoning that has occurred in this city. There's only 2 zones where high rises are. In other areas, you get a lot of flat open space. A zoning plan is the beginning of it. You have a large project, you want a master planner. It's clear that whoever they had who master planned here did a really good job. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just what Jonathan talked about. You want to invest behind good government, or you want to invest when you know bad government is coming out and good government's coming back in, and that's when you get chaos. And those are obviously the most distressed opportunities. But this is solid government. You know, in the United States, we have a big call on Florida. And the reason we do is that Florida reminds us of New York, beginning in the early 1990s, Giuliani, and then proceeding to Mike Bloomberg, who was as legendary a mayor as you're ever going to see out there. And that's because there was a strong compact between government and private business. You see that in Florida today, and I sense it in Qatar. I think that they obviously had an economy that was much more geared towards petrochemical and natural gas and things of that sort, and they're expanding. Tourism is up. The hotels here are magnificent. Who wouldn't come back to this region? It sits on the water. It almost reminds me, I stayed at the Four Seasons in Athens. I don't know that it's it's the wonderful city that sits on the water. So it would seem to me like, this is going to be, I think if we wake up, I remember I went to South Korea in the worst of the market, and I made the mistake of not investing there, and 10 years later I knew it. But here you almost begin to, you sense that there's this really strong leadership that wants to see this city go to the top of the list.
Yeah, but when you talk about, how you see Florida panning out, just give us a sense of how U.S. commercial real estate is doing, because that was the big theme, the last 12 to 18 months. You talk about a lot of pullback in that space. People got involved when interest rates were very low, and obviously we are in a much higher interest rate environment right now. Lots of talks about potential defaults. How do you see it?
So U.S. real estate is going to have a deflationary effect on the U.S. economy for a bit of time. Lots of people bought multifamily at 2 and 2.5% returns, financing it at sub 2 and 2.5% returns. On the other hand, the macro is really strong. KKR just came out with a report today with a major call on multifamily in the United States because we're massively undersupplied on multifamily. And why? Because high interest rates lead to lack of construction activity. And that's the greatest environment for people like me and Jonathan. We follow what construction activity is out there. For instance, in the hospitality business, everybody knows that you get double-digit RevPAR increases when you haven't seen much construction in that area. Well, there hasn't been much construction out there in the United States in the last couple of years because of high rates. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities out there, but you have to pick the areas where you want to be. And it goes back to what this panel was talking about, which is transparency. I think when you get these over-regulated environments, when people become afraid of going into areas where you're going to see potential for rent control, things of that sort, that sort of militates against long-term certainty. And real estate is a long-term business.
Yeah, that leads me nicely to my next topic, which is, Your Excellency, you're head of a new authority that was set up this year. Its purpose was to ultimately be the regulatory authority for real estate within Qatar. What are some of the plans and initiatives that you're introducing to optimize the stated purpose of activating real estate over here?
Under the leadership of His Highness the Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad, the Qatar Real Estate Authority was established 2023. And again, I agree 100% with what Steve was saying. Transparency, we have it as a big topic that we would like to achieve in terms of availability of information for investors and utilizing a digital platform where you could access all of the available information, reliable information for investor or stakeholders in order for you to make a very accurate decision for your investment. And again, I couldn't agree more that leadership of this country is the key enabler for the business and for what we see right now. Jumana, you said you came 2009. I will let you speak. How do you see it different in 2024?
I mean, it's entirely different.
It's a new city.
It's a new city. Hence the name of the panel.
So for us, we are not just a regulator to add a burden for investor, but we are a partner with the private sector, enabler, and try to overcome all of the obstacles in order for businesses to get the right messages, the right processes, and also some of the key initiatives we are trying to introduce in 2024 is the dispute resolution mechanism, whereby we want the system to be clear for FDIs and international businesses. When they come to Doha, they know that they will get world-class standard in terms of infrastructure and all of the ecosystem associated with the real estate. So this is basically, we have a big ambition, and we know we will reach there, and we are your partner in Doha for the real estate market.
Jonathan, earlier on you were talking about the importance of having a long-term vision in place, and that's obviously something that benefits this part of the world. But His Excellency brought up a couple of points on what they're trying to achieve with the real estate authority. Number one, transparency, and number two, a legal framework. How important is it to have the right framework in place in order for investors to feel comfortable that this is where they want to be, not just over the short term, but these are very long-term plans?
As a born Englishman, obviously, the English-based rule of law has been one of its greatest assets as a country over decades. Its legal system has given people stability around the world, and it's enabled people to go around the world and make investments based upon a common set of rules and understanding. And there are countries in the world where you feel less comfortable investing because you don't know if you're going to wake up the next day on the back end of a ruling which negates your investment. So I think one of the great strengths that you're seeing in the region, and you're seeing, multiple industries and people and brands and in hospitality and in sports and in various so many areas coming into the region, is because people feel that level of stability within the region. We're investors in the Oman Group, obviously big players in the region, but big investments into Saudi, for example. We're also partners with Accor in the Delano, which is opening in Dubai, and looking for other areas in the region, Your Excellency, if there are others available, and so on and so forth. As we grow into the region, so we're beginning more and more comfortable to have investments, seeing the stability that in the region to enable us to make those investments and be comfortable that we're in the right place.
Do you worry about the geopolitical headwinds currently?
Look, I heard the Prime Minister speak yesterday, and I admire the way that he addressed the issue within the region. He talked about the need for alignment of interests in ensuring that as soon as possible there is a ceasefire, and ensuring as soon as possible, aligned with that there is a release of the hostages. And I think that everybody hopes across the region for peace across the region. There is no benefit to anybody in the bloodshed that people are seeing. So I think that the current environment, both in the Middle East and also obviously in Europe with Ukraine, is a negative drag on many people who wish to focus on prosperity for their families and peace amongst people. And I think every morning when we wake up, we will pray that during the course of that day or that week, that's where we end up, because it serves nobody's purpose for this endless spiral of murder and blame and counter-blame, which has been going on for the entirety of our lifetimes.
Inshallah, we say in Arabic. Cindy, let me turn to you. You spoke earlier about infrastructure tech, about artificial intelligence, sustainability, a big theme, of course, in planning and real estate visions. How can you square up sustainable projects with projects at scale?
The function of government, public administration, as well as champion companies is to improve the quality of lives, living environment, and livelihood. To drive this, you need large-scale, needle-moving, long-term projects that can't be undertaken by a single company or a single department. So it's an ecosystem approach. So one good example would be the procurement model of the government when tenders are called for long-term, large-scale project, possibly can attract more innovators, diverse pool of capital and know-how by shaping the procurement model to that of a public-private partnership. Now, in order to do that, this further reinforces what His Excellency has said earlier. To attract FDI to participate in PPP projects, you need clear, rule-based, contractual, commercial terms that people can bank on. The projects and endeavor should be bankable, that you can deploy and attract global capital. So not just capital within GCC or capital within some private equity. To me, that is the key.
Stephen, let me ask you a very simple question. Regulation, friend or foe for the industry?
Well, you need rules of the road. That's important. But it can kill the industry. It can. I mean, you're seeing, there's been things, just as an example, there are things that have happened in New York that with rent control, and so plenty of owners have lost value on apartment buildings that they own there. And these are, this is not me taking a shot at New York. It's just a fact. You read about it in the paper. But everybody thinks to themselves when they hear about this, oh, so the value has come down a little bit. But that's not where the big issue is. It's a metastasizing issue, where the banks say, I don't know how to underwrite that market anymore. It used to be that we just had to underwrite where real estate taxes were going to go if they got reassessed. But now we have to underwrite whether you're going to have rent-controlled tenants living in those buildings, and it's going to be a retroactive type of regulation. If we have that, and it can't survive a constitutional challenge, we don't want to lend in that market anymore. And everybody knows in the business that the beginning of bad deals is the beginning of no liquidity in the marketplace. So no liquidity, no bank debt, the bank's getting nervous, that's the end of it. You don't see that in the markets that we're investing in today. And real good distressed buyers, and we think we do that pretty well, but at those particular times, they're looking for signals of overregulation. That's where you really see your best sort of chaotic opportunities, but it's not for the faint-hearted.
Well, we're starting from a very different perspective in the case of Qatar. I'm going to give you the final word, Your Excellency. I don't know if you would like to respond to Stephen, but then also, because we're having a panel about taking cities to the next level, let me just ask you to describe to us what the future of Qatar looks like in your view if you're successful with the real estate repurposing and activation that you talked about.
Actually, just to comment on what Steve was saying, I agree that over-regulation will kill any project. And it's not what we are planning or intending to do here in Qatar. Basically, we started with a public consultation, all the private sector, before enforcing any of the laws, and taking all of the feedback, comments from the stakeholders, trying to understand their concerns before implementing any of the laws. That's why you might find us a little bit slower than what we wanted to initiate, but it's planned to get everybody's feedback and comments, not to be seen as a hurdle in the market, but an enabler to the market, and to assist and to overcome the obstacles in the market. Also, I would like just to announce that we do have a real estate forum which is coming up in October, and I invite you all to attend that forum, which will be 13th, 14th of October, and there will be all of our regulations, standards, and announcements will be officially launched at that venue. Plus, it will be followed by an event whereby you could look at the real estate opportunities in Qatar. Again, Jumana, you told me about the future. 2009 and 2024, you are surprised. Come after 15 years, and I'm sure you will be amazed. This is my...
Is that an invitation?
Yeah. If you are now surprised, in after 15 years, you will be amazed. This is my message to all of you.
That's a good place to leave it. Thank you, gentlemen, Your Excellency, Cindy, for your time.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Sheikha Hanadi Al Thani, Chairperson Injaz Al Arab, and Ronnie Scrivala, Chairperson and co-founder Upgrad.com, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Malika Kapoor.
Sheikha, Ronnie, welcome. We're so happy you could be with us. Sheikha, at Injaz, you are bridging the gap between the youth and the places of work by providing them with essential skills, getting them ready for employment. And Ronnie, with Upgrad, you are disrupting the layer of education outside the formal schooling system. And Ronnie, so you both work with the youth a lot, and Ronnie, I want to begin by asking you a question about our home country, India. We are in the middle of elections in the world's largest democracy. 18 million Indians will be voting for the first time.
That's right.
That's a huge number.
Everything is a huge number in India. So.
It is indeed. What is the youth of India voting for in this election?
Yeah, well, look, thank you for having me. Firstly, I'd say one thing it's not looking for is change. I think one thing we're all very clear is that it's never going to be business as usual. But I think today, if I look at it in India, and I interact people when we're looking at education, but also in the rural sector, it's one of the few countries where I think people think that tomorrow is going to be better than yesterday. And I think that emotion takes you to aspiration and ambition, right? I mean, I think we have been a developing country for many times, which means aspiration and ambition needs to go to the next level. So I think today the youth is definitely looking at a certain sense of endorsement, a certain sense of strong will. I think the fact that we've now got that level of strong leadership, a decisive leadership, is making a change. 1.4 billion people is always very, very difficult to manage, to bring together, a lot of diversity. But at the end of the day, I think we're looking for change in a certain particular manner, which is really to get the direction. I think in the last 10 years, we've seen an incredible amount of decisiveness, stability, good progress, many challenges, but leadership that knows and is on top of it.
That's interesting that you said that they're not voting for change, because I would imagine that the youth of India would be voting and demanding more jobs, because that is a huge issue, not just in India, but also in the Middle East. And I'm going to come back to you with a question on jobs. But Sheikh, I want to speak to you. And the Middle East has a huge youthful population, but a third of this population is unemployed. How did we get to such a situation?
Well, thank you for the question, Malika. Let's put it into context. I think we have one of the highest percentages of youth population in the world. 65% of the population of the Arab world of the MENA region is under the age of 25. Mm-hmm. If you take it into consideration, this is around 200 million people. Now, you said we have double or triple the average of unemployment within that sector. So we have around 50 million people who are out of jobs, unemployed. How did we get there? We are a region that is plagued by instability, by turmoil, and we are facing an ever-changing landscape of changes in the way we live, in technological transformation. But I think the most important, of course, there are multiple other factors for unemployment, but I think one of the most important factors is this disconnect between the skills that that our youth gather from their educational system and the skills that are required to enter the labor market of today and tomorrow. This disconnect is just becoming bigger and bigger with the technological advancement, with the changes that in our environment, with the changes that we've seen. And it's very interesting that you say, business as usual. We haven't seen any kind of usual business for the last 20 decades. We've witnessed the meltdown of the financial institutions, high inflation rates, lower inflation rates, high interest rates, COVID, in some countries, geopolitical problems. So it is not business as usual. It hasn't been the case for the longest period of time. And in the case of unemployment, it's just added pressure on the unemployment levels, which are staggering. And I think one of the most important things is that the despair the youth in the Arab world feel, they do not see a better tomorrow, as you said, for democracy. They actually feel that they have nowhere to go. They're not going into the labor market. They cannot achieve financial independence. They cannot even aspire to become better for tomorrow.
I'm going to come to you, the question on jobs, but I want to remind you all that we would love to receive your questions, and I will be polling you in just a few minutes. So if you want to get out your phones, you'll see a QR code up shortly, and you can just register, but get ready with your phones because a polling question is coming your way soon. But Rani, back to jobs. In India, it seems the more educated you are, the less likely you are to get a job. I refer to a recent report by the ILO, and it says the jobless rate for graduates, 29%. For those who can't read or write, 3.5%. So back to Sheikha's point, there is a disconnect, right, between the jobs that are being created and the skill set the youth have. Talk to me about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting point that you raised, that the more educated you are. I think there's a learning lesson for all of us, because with the change that's happening overall, I guess the more educated you are, the more opinionated you are, the more rigid you are, the more you think you've done it, the more calendared you are, versus lifelong learning is where it's going to change. So the point is, how much are you flexible to change, and how much is somebody, because I think today we're seeing that in the corporate world, we're seeing that in countries, we're seeing that everywhere else, that the scruffiness and the people who and the younger generation comes up with completely new ideas. So I think just to comment on that, I think for a country like ours, the government needs to be a very strong catalyst, but it's not the sole responsibility only of the government. I think infrastructure and what we're doing in many other places is something that's helping. But to me, the two core parts that's creating the change for jobs is, I think we've for the longest time been what I would call an outsourced economy in our mindset. And I think that's changing to creating your own intellectual property. And that's changing the national pride also. So we're moving from what the IT industry did incredibly well, but from an outsourced part to an intellectual property and ownership and origination part. And I think that's going to create an incredible amount of opportunities. And I think the second one is, whether we like it or not, the robust startup economy in the country. And I know we keep talking about job seekers versus job creators. And I think it's not about the unicorns that are happening in the country, because I think that gets over-magnified. But actually the small and medium-scale industry in a country like India is the heartthrob of creating those employment opportunities. Because the more we have small-scale and medium-scale entrepreneurs, rather than just the 100 unicorns, they are the ones that are actually creating the ecosystem. So I think between government, catalyst, infrastructure, and the clarity of thought on one side, and look, even though we have challenges, 9 out of 10 people who go abroad to study want to come back to India.
So you're seeing reverse brain drain?
There is a sense of a bell ringing for people, not just from a nationalistic point of view and national pride point of view, but also job opportunities point of view.
That's interesting, seeing a reverse brain drain. But you talked about changing the landscape and diversification when it comes to jobs, and we're seeing a huge push for that in the Middle East, diversification away from an oil-based economy. And as Ronnie said, this isn't just a responsibility of the government. The private sector has to play a role as well. Tell me, are you seeing enough job opportunities being created in, say, Qatar, for example, which is beyond the oil sector?
I think diversification has moved dramatically for the last 4 decades, and we've achieved that within the GCC. We've achieved a good trajectory into diversification. But it goes back to, a small statistic. 2 of every 3 jobs created in the GCC are government jobs. So there is a lack of jobs within the private sector. But our economies are dominated by the public sector, where in the OECD, we see 70% of the growth coming from SMEs. The growth in our region comes from this massive public sector that is moving growth forward. So saying that, there has been an immense push towards entrepreneurship, SMEs, creating the ecosystem that provides the small and medium businesses with the perfect way to flourish, to become bigger, and they are becoming job creators. And we see it's astonishing. They're going into every value-added sector in the economy, let it be from ICT to tourism, to healthcare, to everything. So we've seen that happening. But this comes on the shoulder of 4 decades of reforming our education systems, understanding we need to diversify away from hydrocarbon, and promoting a much smoother policies for SMEs. This can't be said for the rest of the Arab world. We, as Injaz, we work on 13 Arab countries, so we see a big variety of systems in play. There are still countries where the public sector is still growing, and we do have countries that 65% of the unemployment comes from higher education seekers. So there is a mismatch between the policies that are happening and what we're trying to achieve, which is lower unemployment and more employment for the youth.
Now I want to add there, if I can, because I think we kind of focus on job creation as the entry point. But today, I think the world has changed. I think we need to figure out that when companies were looking at, the language was always the top 90% and the bottom 10% is being evaluated.
Yes.
I think the need today for everyone to be in the top 50 percentile. So it's true, government is a strong enabler for jobs. Government is about the last place now you get job security in some form or the other. But the other 75% of any economy, the job security is not taken for granted. So your job creation is not just about it, but it's about the retention. Because most organizations are looking now for the top 50% of performers. Because the balance 50%, consumers have changed it, technology has changed it, and many things else have changed it. So we need to keep the entry point a little realistic to the point of the end return also.
No, absolutely. And this is a good time for me to bring up the polls, so let's get it up on the screen. And the reason we decided to include this poll is we're all leaders in this room over here. You're either employing the youth, or you're training the youth, you're educating the youth, or you're parenting them. What's your greatest responsibility towards the next generation? Is it for us to mitigate climate change, create jobs, educate or train them, or simply to provide political stability? So please punch in your answers, and while you do that, Ronnie, let me come to you. Which one would you pick? 1, 2, 3, or 4?
See, I mean, I wouldn't pick any of the 4. I think for me, empowering, because firstly, we need to understand. I don't think we're understanding the next generation. So I think if we don't understand it, it's like in your job, if you don't accept you have a problem, you're not going to solve anything. So I think understanding is one. And empowering, to me, would be two important elements of that. Because once you do that, they can actually create a path that you don't think you need to lay it out for them.
Why do you think you don't understand them?
Why do we think we don't understand them?
Why do you think you don't understand?
Do we really understand them? I mean,
they'll probably say that you don't,
it's our
but
own
do you
interpretation
believe?
of how that works. But if you really, really understand that, and that generation used to change once in 20 years, then it became every decade. Now it's every 5 years.
Oh, it's very quick, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
It is.
Sheikha, which one would you pick?
Well, I will add my voice to Ronnie. I think in my case, I've dedicated 20 years of my life in empowering youth and making sure that there is job creation for the youth and making sure that we can listen to them. I don't know if we can understand them or not, but being a mother, maybe I was closer to the youth and I saw how attitude has changed. And working in schools, attitudes, perceptions, inspirations have changed. And I think this is where I would go with education and creating jobs as my main responsibility.
Well, I think you're absolutely in touch with what the room is thinking, because we have 56% agreeing that the responsibility really is to educate and train the youth, which is exactly what both of you are providing.
Yeah, but with a devil's advocate view, that do we really know? Education, it sounds like we are going to educate them, but the point is that we need to redefine what that means. And I think if we don't accept that, we might be educating them in the vision of how we want them to play out. And that's not going to be a very progressive, innovative world, because tastes are changing, consumers are changing, technology is changing, and yet we want to prescribe the way we educate them. So we just need to be careful about that part.
And just to add to this point, we play a small role within educating them. We need this private-public partnership with educational society, with educational communities, first of all, to open the dialogue on how this education is going to happen, because we know that the education of today is not going to be what we need for our labor for tomorrow. So we need to open, first of all, a dialogue, and then have our voices heard, and then do what we've promised them. So as private sector, we need to have a say, and we have responsibility towards the educational systems, how to partner with them, how to provide them with the upskilling, reskilling, retooling of our youth.
Going back to this point of, do we really understand the youth, and do they believe that they can trust the two generations? You know, there seems to be a breakdown in trust. And we are seeing this play out. I mean, young people are agitating and protesting about climate change, about social justice. We've seen the scenes play out on campuses in the US, for example, and this does speak to a breakdown in trust. How do we begin to address that issue? How do we get the youth to believe in and rebuild trust in institutions?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair question. And I think that, again, to me, is building on the fact of you understanding what that is and not making it templated. So I think trust is a two-way street. And I think today, if you ask me, when we went through the education question, my 8 years of being in the education system has really taught me one thing, that peer-to-peer learning today is getting more active and more responsive to people than the way in which we think we've been educating, which is it's not outdated that a professor lectures, but today people are looking for peer-to-peer. And the reason you're seeing demonstrations, whatever else, because they're talking to themselves. And they feel that if you're prescribing for me something, then I need to have my voice. If my voice is ring-fenced, then I'm not building any trust. So I think if you look at peer-to-peer, and if you want to change the education system, people today, like social media is where you want to go. Marketing doesn't work. You want to travel, you want to go to a destination, you're more interested in what 600 people said. You want to consume a movie, you look at what the reviews say. You're not going to look at the marketing campaign anymore.
No.
So similarly in learning and in education, you want to understand that I pose a question, I'd love my professor to answer it, but I'd love my 60 other colleagues in the classrooms to answer it even better, because they'll give me something I can identify with. Similarly, when you're looking at demonstrations, I think it's about that. It's not about mistrust. It's just a very different communication level where you're ring-fencing me. And look, I think governments have also moved a little bit to the right around the world, right? Whether we like it or not. So now there's that balance that the younger generation is a little lost in that. So then they feel we'll do our own thing.
I think there is a bit of short-sightedness and in some cases deafness. We don't want to hear what we don't want. So it's very nice if the youth are speaking in our tongue and what we want them to say, as long as they are thinking outside the box and they provide themselves with their value sets. And it's amazing that we're going back to an era where the youth are going back to the values that we encourage them to have, and now we're telling them, no, we don't want to hear that. I don't like the manner of some of the violence, I don't like how it's taken through, but I think it is really double standards in one case and very short-sightedness that to say, we don't want to hear that, it's going to stop.
I'm keeping an eye on the clock, but one thing I do want us to talk about is the impact of AI on education and on jobs, because it is a significant impact. And what's interesting is that both India and the Middle East have this great benefit of really good internet penetration. In India, that's happened more recently. But given that that infrastructure is more or less in place now, how do you think you can get the youth digitally ready for an AI-enhanced future?
It's also a mindset change, Malika, because I think we overestimate that connectivity means everything is solved. And if you're a very digital nation, everything is solved. I think the mindset needs to be there. In a country like India, it's complex, right? Because 600 million people are living in rural India. So that's a different connotation, not just from connectivity, but at their level. They're not people where, when we're running a not-for-profit, the first question we need to ask at school is, what do you want to do when you grow up? That's not a question we all in this room take for granted. Nobody's asked us that because we pretty much know it. There's a whole segment of people who don't know what aspiration means, what financial inclusion means, what being ambitious means. How do you take that and use something as alien to them as artificial intelligence and make it a learning tool for them? Because in that artificial intelligence is going to be a pretty standard approach. It's not going to have a different approach for different learning levels of people. You may have it, it can be language specific. So I think those are some of the nuances that will need to be there. But by and large, I think the younger generation is much more acceptance to change, and therefore will take that in a much more positive manner.
We're embodying it. We're using it to deliver our programs. We're using it to upskill and reach people that we've never reached. It does depend on connectivity, so we are trying to conquer that first of all, and infrastructure as well. They have in the Arab world different kinds of infrastructure, from the GCC, which is well connected, which has a perfect infrastructure, to areas like Yemen, like Sudan, where you have hardly any internet or but we have to use it to our advantage.
And just there, I would say it's very important that we look at it as more as a personalized one rather than actually democratizing. Because suddenly we make it as a standard approach. AI can solve this. Actually, we need to use something as powerful as that to personalize it more than generalize it. I think will be very impactful.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, but I really appreciate you all being here with me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Please welcome to the stage His Excellency Saad bin Ali Al Kharji, Chairman of Qatar Tourism of the State of Qatar. His Excellency Ahmed Al Khatib, Minister of Tourism of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Sebastian Bazin, Group Chairman and CEO of Accor, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Jomana Bersetchi.
Tourism. You would have heard a lot about tourism the last couple of days if you've been watching these panels and listening to the explanation of how the implementation of the respective visions of Qatar and Saudi Arabia are going. Diversification is a big part of that, and leaning into sectors like tourism is a very important pillar in that diversification strategy. So we're going to talk about the future of tourism in the Gulf region, And not just specific to each individual country, but also this concept of collaborative tourism. So where multi-destination tourism comes in amongst the countries within the GCC. And then, of course, the role the private sector is going to play in helping to bring those plans to fruition. So, Your Excellency, I would love to start with you. And in my earlier panels, I also brought up the World Cup, but I think it is, and it was, a very important event in terms of putting Qatar on the global map as a tourist destination, as a destination for sporting events. What comes next?
I'm very happy to be with you, Jumana, and my brother Ahmed and Sebastian. Actually, the World Cup in Qatar played and Qatar being pioneer by hosting such mega event in the region. We can see that the effect of hosting the World Cup in Doha, how affected the tourism in the whole region. And it's showcasing our beauty of our culture, our art, museum, and everything is in the Gulf are ready to host such events. And you can see the other GCC countries follows and targeting such mega events. And this reflects also our leadership, how consider tourism and importance of tourism to diversify our economy. As Qatar or Saudi Arabia and UAE, they are mostly known for oil and gas and these natural resources. But now we believe in tourism, how much can contribute to our GDP and how much we can show to the world this spot, it's worth to explore. And this is the right time for our region.
And is it contingent on holding these type of big events, or is the goal for there to be regular stream of tourists coming in, irrespective of hosting these fantastic mega events like the World Cup?
You know, we are now working on upholding the benefits of hosting the World Cup and build on top of that, and develop our strategy and regulations to be able to enable this private sector and tourism to grow and receiving more people. You see, after the pandemic, the GCC, which was one of the fastest growing in tourism, it's recovered very quickly, and the demand is very high. We have high connectivity airlines, so in Qatar, as Qatar Airways, as award-winning airlines, or in our neighbors, the Emirates or Etihad, and upcoming Riyadh Air. So it's growing up.
Yeah. Your Excellency, I had a look at the Saudi numbers. Tourism's current GDP contribution is 4.5%, and you aim to get that to 10% by 2030. If my numbers are off, please correct me. How do you get from 4.5% today to 10% in 2030?
Thank you, Jumana, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the government of Qatar and my friend Abdulaziz for inviting me to be part of this very important forum. We got from 3.5 to 4.5 in about 2 years. I think in 7 years we can get to 5. Travel and tourism is a very important industry globally. It represents 10% of the global economy and 10% of the global jobs. And this region share of this market is about 7.5%, the GCC region. And I believe our fair market share is 10%. And therefore, we realized, all of us in the region, that this is a very important sector. In Saudi Arabia, it is one of the main pillars in Vision 2030. And we are committed to take this sector contribution to both job and economy to 10% by 2030. How to do that? We have already put all the plans, and we are growing very fast. And we are putting in the pipeline to build more than 250,000 key rooms. Accor is an example. In 20 years, they have established 41 hotels, and in the next 7 years, they will add 45. They will double their capacity in Saudi Arabia in terms of number of buildings, number of hotels, and expanding the roads Airports, we are adding King Salman Airport with 120 million capacity, like Hamad Airport here in Qatar. And we are establishing new airlines, Riyadh Airlines, for point to point. We're making the access to Saudi Arabia very easy through online visa and more direct flight from the main cities globally that produce tourists to the main cities in Saudi Arabia. And building and investing in major destinations, I would call it cities, you know, like Neom, Red Sea, Qiddiya, Diriyah, with announced investment of more than $800 billion in the next 7 years. All this and many others will help the country to get its the contribution of tourism to the economy to 10% by 2030, and we aim to more than that. I believe we, like Qatar, put all the plans to grow this very important sector and to capture our fair market share of this very important industry. This is a very important industry also for jobs. In the last 5 years, we added 250,000 jobs to the sector. 60% of these jobs were captured by women, and this is very important, and more than 60% were captured by youth, young people. I think this is one of the best sectors for job creation. I think, I believe we in the GCC have everything to create another industry. We've been successful in the last decades to create the oil and gas, the petrochemical industries, and financial services, and so on and so forth. And I think we started, all of us, to invest in this very important industry for the future and to unlock the value, the hidden values that we have collectively in the GCC.
What are the main tourism geographies that you're looking to attract? Where are you looking to get tourists from?
Well, actually, we run a very simple formula. 2080. Which are the countries that export the 80% of the tourists in terms of number? And the number is quite risky, you know. We focus on value or spend more than the number. And therefore, you know, we have started to see some countries, and most recently Japan, a few days ago, are complaining about over-tourism. So we want to focus on the countries that the GDP per capita is higher than others, countries that is within 6-hour flight, and we are, both of us, are located in a very strategic geographical location where within 8 hours flight, we access to almost 40% of the global population. So we don't have the problem of, you know, being far away from the main hubs. And therefore, China is a target, Europe is a target, the emerging middle class in India is a very good target for all of us. We have the plans to reach to these target markets and attract them for various reasons, whether to visit their family and friends who lives in our countries, or to come and perform their religious duties, or to come and enjoy the sport and the leisure activities, or the conferences like this conference.
So I had the privilege of speaking to Sebastian back in January 2021, and if you remember, that was peak pandemic-ish around January 2021. It was a very difficult time for the hospitality sector, and I've got to say, to give you credits, you were very optimistic about the future of the sector at the time. And one of the questions I asked you, I went back and watched our interview, 1.5 billion people traveled in 2019. The year later, obviously, it dropped by 70%. And you said to me, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that number come back in 2023, possibly 2024. Last year, the number was 1.3 billion. So give us a sense of how quickly things have come back, and also why the growth has been so much quicker in this part of the world where we are right now.
It's simple, because it is the best industry in the world.
Okay. Not biased or anything.
Right. No, but I'm provoking you a bit, but I mean it, and I'll tell you why I mean it. Travel tourism, and you both said it rightly, it is 11% of the GDP in the world. It is the second largest industry on this planet, behind media and telecom industry. It is 12% of the jobs in the world work for travel and tourism. It is the only industry where you provide inclusiveness, diversity, chance in life, underprivileged people, and give them a chance. The only one, because you don't need to go to university to probably work in a hotel. We at Accor alone, every year, we hire more than 100,000 people, every single year. 60% of them never went to university, never had a job before. So, and I really believe, seriously, this is probably the best medicine to prevent conflict, is travel and tourism. Because when you discover somebody else's culture, somebody else's heritage, if you learn from differences, then you probably have greater respect. So, and it's an industry which is super easy to predict, because it's only linked to one factor, demography. When I was born, the planet had 2.8 billion people. Today, close to 7.8 billion. In one lifetime, you added 5 billion people, and it took over 2,000 years to go to 2.8 billion people when I was born. So the more people exist on the planet, the more you're going to have emergence of middle-class population, as you do have in India, in China, and many places. Those people have the wherewithal to travel, both, they start domestically, and then they go abroad. So you just have to be a welcomer, host those people, have the right infrastructure, have the right, basically, people working for you. It's a blessed industry. We've been growing at 3 to 5% for the last 50 years. Of course, we had hiccup, 2008 and COVID, and I was on my knees when I was with you in 2021. We almost died. But I was telling everybody, wait, it's only going to be a matter of 2 or 3 years, and the recovery today, I'm guaranteeing you the next 20 years, the growth will be 5 to 7% per year, not 3 to 5. Why? Demography, emerging middle class, and airlines. We are extremely linked to the numbers of new planes being ordered.
Yeah.
And see, you're going to watch in the next 5 years, between now and next 5 years, India will change our industry profoundly, both within India and outside of India. And you in the GCC and Southeast Asia, you will be by far the best beneficiaries of the Indian new emerging middle class travelers, because as they do with the Chinese, 80% of Chinese, they stay in Asia Pacific. India, they will stay within 5 hours radius flying. They're going to go Southeast Asia if they go east. If they go west, they're going to go to Egypt and the GCC and North Africa. It's a fabulous industry. The problem is it's a human capital industry, so it's tough to operate, and you have to accept the risk.
So I actually spoke to the CEO of Riyadh Air, Tony Douglas, a week ago, and he was very excited about the possibilities that becoming a commercial operation in 2025 is going to open up. Before we move on, I just want to ask you one question also, because we spoke about this off stage, is the importance of the luxury sector and how you think creating a tourism package around the luxury space is going to be more appealing to people who are looking to start exploring this part of the world.
Your Excellency, you said it a minute ago. We have to be very careful here. When you start and you open your country to travel and tourism, usually you start with the economic, mid-scale, affordable brand, because that's what people need domestically, and that's what people could afford when they travel. The more mature your country is coming, then you go up the scale and you go to luxury and lifestyle, because then you have a better value spent per visitors. So Sub-Saharan Africa today is 80% economy mid-scale. If you go to some mature countries 20 years after the fact, it's luxury upscale. So it depends on the early stage or the later stage of those countries.
Your Excellency, a follow-up question to that, given the scale of how much growth we're going to see, and perhaps a question to both of you, and I do want to get on to the next topic, which is the collaboration, but maybe a very quick answer on whether you think there's going to be a problem in creating or finding enough talent for the jobs that will be created in the future.
As we have here in Qatar, and since tourism became one of the pillars of our NDS and aligned with Qatar Vision 2030, we set a goals and target. It's to increase our contribution to GDP by 12% by 2030. Number two, to increase the employment in this sector. We cannot achieve the numbers we want unless we enable the rules and regulations and training to increase the employment in the sector. And there is a huge potential in the market here in Doha. We can grow this up. We set our plans to reach this point. And this will lead for increasing the domestic spend within the country. This is why we see now tourism become very important, not only in Qatar, and also you can see the impact in Saudi Arabia and how much employment they have for a recent few years. We have university teaching hospitality and tourism. We have in Qatar Tourism Service Excellence Academy, which assure the service excellence in all their aspects in Doha. And we growing this up by some modification in the rules and regulations.
Your Excellency, do you foresee an issue?
This is a very important question. Our industry will be facing two challenges. One, digitalization. I believe, and I've been pushing very hard not to digitalize the whole journey, because the tourists wants to interact with people. When you get into the black taxi in London, you speak with the driver, and you get a flavor of what is going on in London. And you meet with the reception or the concierge, you can discuss various things. And therefore, we have to be very careful what to digitalize and what to keep with the human. And the manpower. The manpower is extremely important. You can find the same buildings, the same Fairmont Hotel in Doha or Hong Kong or London, and the same systems and the same food. However, you cannot find the same people. You want to use your local people. The only resource that will convert and convey your local culture to your visitors are the people, the local people. And therefore, we looked at this seriously in Saudi Arabia, and we have a big population, 70% below 30 years old. They don't want in the past to join the sector. We increased the starting point of their salaries to be at the level of the financial sector, to make the sector as attractive. And we started to provide them with a career path. In the past, they don't see themselves working on this sector for forever. They come to the sector and then they join the government in different jobs. And we have been investing actually, $100 million every year to train 100,000 people every year. And recently we have launched a program with a core group to train the young Saudis. We want them to be in the business. We want them to work on the airlines and in the airports, and to drive the Uber, and to work on the hotel and the hospitality. And and to become the tour guides, and so on and so forth. This will enrich the journey and the experience of the visitors to the country. Human capital is important. I was extremely happy when I visited the Red Sea, the first resort in the Red Sea. It's the St. Regis and the Six Senses. I know you're going to open hotels soon, but in the St. Regis, there are 300 people working on the hotel. 150 of them are young Saudis, boys and girls. I took a photo with them, and I was so happy to see them, serving their guests and transferring the local culture and enriching the experience of our international visitors.
If I may add on this, here in GCC we have something I think it's unique and worth to showcase it. We don't have Eiffel Tower, we don't have Colosseum in Rome. We have the genuine Gulf people hospitality and authentic hospitality. And the best way to show this to the world, if we have this employment, our Qataris and Saudis or locals or who lives in Doha and Qatar and have the same identity of hospitality and the generosity, this can promote and give the visitor the full experience and very well treated here.
Yeah.
So we are promoting our hospitality and will be through this.
Let me ask you about the state of collaboration amongst GCC countries, and what are you doing in that space to tailor-make a tourism destination that is multi-destination, not just specific to Qatar, but around the GCC as a whole? Have there been discussions?
Jumana, looks behind you.
Literally look behind
No,
you.
I'm touched. Here we are in Doha, in Qatar, and they are very nicely showing a picture of Alula in Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
This is the beginning of what we're just asking.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, this is one of our recent collaboration with Kingdom Saudi, and especially between Qatar Tourism and Ministry of Tourism in Saudi. We launched a joint program called Double Your Discovery. We are promoting Qatar and Saudi in one campaign, and we identified a few markets to launch this campaign. And we can see how it's growing up and picking up, and people would love to come and have double experience in one region, 1 hour away by flight, and have different cuisine, different culture, but you feel that you are in one country. This is taking us to the benefits of collaboration. The competition, you see it in the region now, we see it's cumulative efforts. And end of this year, we might see the unified GCC visa, which also will contribute to the number of visitors to this region. And His Excellency,
I think, Jumana, this is also a very good question. I look at the world in three bulks: the East culture, the West culture, and the Arabian culture. And, to demonstrate the real Arabian culture and hospitality, it's the GCC. And therefore, we hosted the Ministers of Tourism meetings in Al-Ula in 2021. And we came up with the declaration that we proposed to the leaders to approve a one visa to make the travel between the GCC countries seamless, like Europe. And the leaders were very kind to approve it last year and hand it over to the Minister of Interiors to discuss the details and to come up with the unified system. I think the first step is to make the travel between the GCC countries seamless, and then to start working on a joint packages and joint flights and joint promotion programs to put this emerging destination in the global travel map.
Yeah.
And this is what we are doing. We started with Qatar, and this is going to be a pilot. Actually, we started with Qatar during the World Cup, where if you get a visa, you can access the two countries. And the program, or that pilot, was extremely successful. And we will build on this. But definitely, this is a very important region. We can offer a lot. We are in Saudi Arabia developing a full year destination. However, in the winter, more than 2 billion people living in a temperature around or below zero, where they can swim here and they can enjoy the sun in our winter.
Yeah. Sebastian, I've got maybe just 1 minute, but I do want to ask you, from your perspective, what type of potential would this unlock, this collaborative tourism drive?
Well, for me, it's for our core and for many of us, GCC is the fastest growth region on the planet. It is for travel and tourism. Far beyond. We are already 25% better than 2019. The rest of the world is in between -5 to +5. And it's not by accident. And the reason why that is, and don't ask me to choose between Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar.
I wouldn't dare.
I came in Doha in 1991, so like 33 years ago. So, and this is my job, is to promote the region, but also to explain that what you're going to be discovering in Doha and in Qatar is very different from what you will be likely discovering from the UAE, and also very different from Saudi. Some of them are ahead on culture, some of them are being ahead on heritage, some of them are ahead on gastronomy. It's a different, but it's worth spending 7 days within 3 countries. For me, it's a true blessing. What I'm adding, when I said not coming by accident, and I'm not basically giving something you want me to say, but what I'm so surprised and bluffed is leadership. In each of those regions, why is it growing that fast? It's because there is a plan, there's a vision, there's ambition, there is destinations, there is financial muscles, there is manpower. All of that has been structured, programmed, developed, different pace, but you don't have this in many other continents, and I wish we had more of this in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellencies, and thank you, Sebastian, as ever.
Thank you, Jumana. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Jerry Cardinal, founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of Redbird Capital Partners, Brandon Gardner, partner, co-founder, and president of RAIN, Greg Lemkow, co-CEO of BDT and MSD Partners, and Amanda Staveley, CEO of PCP Capital Partners and co-owner of Newcastle United FC, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Jason Kelly.
All right. So now we get to talk some sports. Heard about tourism, now we hear about sports. You all look great. So we want to dig into a couple different issues here. We're going to talk about deal making. We're going to talk about the institutional play that's happening in sports right now. But to sort of set the stage, Jerry, I want to start with you. As you look across the world, you have AC Milan, you have the UFL, you have lots of different interests across sports. What's the state of deal making for sports right now, if you had to distill it?
Well, I'll distill it in one word: bubble.
Whoa, okay, good.
And so, you know, I think we've had it for a while. And bubble doesn't really do justice to it. I mean, these are phenomenal pieces of intellectual property that are intrinsically extremely valuable. There's just a tremendous amount of capital, particularly a lot of new capital, chasing them. And I think you got to ask yourself, when you talk about deal making, what kind of deal making are you talking about? Most people, when you talk about investing in sports, most people think today that means buying teams. And I would say that, you know, that's the trickiest part of the deal-making ecosystem. I think there's a lot of really creative investing that can be done, not involving the ownership of teams, minority stake or control stake, but around the monetization of the intellectual property that those teams or leagues represent.
And so, Amanda, do you agree with that assessment? I mean, you have a stake in Newcastle. You do a lot of deal-making, especially outbound from this region. What do you see in terms of valuations? Because when I hear bubble, I think prices are getting really high. What do you make of it?
No, I think valuations are continuing. I mean, there's scarce resource, and I think Jerry's absolutely right. I think, there's because there's such scarce assets and because they're so prized, and with the increasing investment into media rights, and there's a lot more institutional capital coming in. I think more institutional capital will chase the stricter regulatory environment. I think the fact that we've got financial controls actually protects some investment. So I think there's going to be a more, I think actually investment in leagues and individual assets, there's obviously pros and cons with both. You can diversify perhaps your risk a great deal more in terms of investing in leagues, although getting there and getting the right league is difficult. So yeah, I think Jerry's pretty changed. And in terms of, you start with capital? You say, capital markets, I think, will really support what is currently a more inherently private market.
And so, Greg, one of the questions around sports is always, can you get in and can you get out? Sort of this liquidity question and the ability to actually do the deals. You've been around lots of transactions. Most recently, I believe your firm advised on the Baltimore Orioles back in the United States. You've worked with Endeavor on UFC and done many other things. How easy is it to sort of get in and out, as it were?
Well, again, it depends which asset you're talking about. I think if you can invest in sports leagues, you do that all day long, and I think there'll always be a supply of it. I think the thing that's really developed over the past 5 or 10 years has been the introduction of institutional capital into the market. And that, especially as it relates to sports teams, I think one of the things I used to tell my clients is buying a minority stake in a sports team was like really, really, really expensive season tickets. Yeah. That's kind of all you got out of it. And that's changed. You've seen a massive increase in the valuation of these franchises and these leagues. And so it's been an appreciating asset. And then you've actually seen with the introduction of institutional capital, liquidity. And that's been a major difference. So you've got the ability to buy a minority stake and get out because there's a real market for it. And then if you think about what's happened to a lot of these families that own these teams, for a while, at the beginning, it was their hobby. It was what they did with their excess cash, and it was something fun. Now, for the vast majority of them, it is the vast majority of their wealth. And so if you think about now generational transition around some of this ownership, the introduction of institutional capital provides liquidity to help facilitate that. So, a lot of people have been worried, is institutional capital going to crowd out individuals? Yeah. I think it's actually quite beneficial to them because it's just more capital around it that creates liquidity for everybody.
And so, Brandon, you're in the midst of a lot of these deals as well, and you've seen the evolution. You guys have been an architect of the evolution of the sort of the maturity of this market in a lot of ways. What does have, building on what Greg was just saying, institutions, individuals coming together, they can coexist, I would hope, but what does that look like, and what happens when the rubber meets the road there?
Yeah, I mean, 100% they can coexist. I would say probably two things. When you think about institutional capital, there's just the volume of money that's available, but I think it's also the flexible nature of institutional capital for all different parts of the ecosystem. So if you think about the individuals that own teams, anything you want to do with the team before, it was just always you had to fund it. You have to put in more money, more equity into the company. Now you have all of these different players and providers financing different pieces of that, whether that's transfer window financing in the European leagues, stadium financing, things like that. And I think that's driving the entire ecosystem around sports, both the teams, the leagues, as well as everything else in the ancillary, the ancillary universe around sports and how you monetize it.
I think that the one thing I'd say that's interesting on Jerry's comment around valuations, because it's right, they just keep going up. And so we saw the Denver Broncos in the National Football League sell at $4.6 billion. It was eye-popping. And then the Commanders at $6 billion. It was eye-popping. And now there's discussion of a minority stake in the Dolphins at north of $7 billion. Not even control. And none of those are supportable by a discounted cash flow analysis, right? And so people talk about revenue multiples, but it's not really it's more to compare across them. But the reality is it is now, with all the capital, it's become an asset class, and it's like art. What's it worth? It's worth what someone's going to pay for it. And so it may feel bubbly, and I think Jerry's right, but these valuations have only gone one way, and I expect them to continue to go that way.
So it feels like one of the holy grails in investing is the National Football League, but back home. By all accounts, Bloomberg is reporting, others as well, following Bloomberg naturally, that soon, maybe as soon as next week, the NFL owners are going to approve minority stakes on behalf of institutional investors. Jerry, this is something you followed very closely. You are a founding investor in the UFL, which is the combination of the USFL and the XFL. See, I got it right. I did not call it the XFL. You understand football. What does this mean if institutional money really is coming into the NFL? Because this has been long sought after, certainly wanted by the institutional class. What does it mean?
Well, you know, it's funny, and Greg, you'll appreciate this. And the NFL reminds me of Goldman Sachs. You know, Greg and I had the majority of our career at Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs.
Weren't you in the same analyst class?
Yes, we were. We started together. And, you know, Goldman would always watch everybody trailblaze. They'd see what worked and what didn't work. And then when they found what worked, they would come in full force and blow everybody else out. That's what the NFL's doing here.
Yeah.
The NFL's watched, to their credit, they've watched this capitalism going to work. You know, it's the new money that's come into sports that deems it an asset class. You know, I've been investing in sports for 25 years, and I'm not so sure, you know, when the equity research for sports is Forbes magazine, you know.
You mean Bloomberg.
Or Bloomberg, right. You know, when Goldman Sachs or any of the firms start writing really credible, detailed research on sports, let's sit down and talk about that. But it is indicative of the fact that, you know, we have an imbalance here, and it's overshot. But you know, the great thing about capitalism is it self-corrects. So the NFL has watched, and what's great about the NFL is they're going to most likely embrace the introduction of institutional capital into their ecosystem, but on their terms and in their way. And I think that's a huge positive because, you know, it's a little bit of the Wild West right now. And it's interesting, you know, from an NFL owner's perspective, you know, a question one could ask is, how is an NBA team worth more than an NFL team, right? And the answer is, well, for the most part, there's difference, you know, at different bookends of the spectrum. Maybe that's the case, but in general, that's not the case. But it is by virtue of the artificial inflation of valuations that you've seen go on, by the capital formation around buying minority stakes in teams with no governance and no pathway to liquidity. And so I think it's a positive because the NFL's doing it the way they're doing it in a way that's adaptive to their ecosystem. And again, you know, if you're Roger Goodell, step back, what's your goal? So the last high watermark was $6 billion on a trade. We did have the price talk around the Dolphins at 7. You know, his goal is to get this linearly with as little volatility as possible to 10 billion a team.
Right.
Will that happen? Yes, that will happen.
How soon?
Won't be all of them.
How soon at 10 billion?
Well, if you ask Jerry Jones, he'd tell you right now.
Right.
But Jerry Jones is.
Jerry Jones would tell you a lot of things right now.
Well, but Jerry Jones isn't transacting on a control basis.
Yes.
But look, I mean, the price talk around the Dolphins, if it's true, is interesting. Here's the punchline. The punchline is it's artificially inflated. If you're the NFL, that's okay because, you know, they'll always be able to catch up. In a lot of these other instances, the question is going to be, particularly for investors, you know, what's the entry point for you? Because you've had this massive escalation in these valuations, and frankly, a lot of the times, people in the infrastructure hasn't kept pace.
Right.
And it's in that dislocation that, frankly, I look at that, and that's basically our investment model. You go into that gap and you close it by creating companies around these teams and leagues.
Right.
I'd say the one piece that's interesting, especially on the NFL, is I agree with Jerry. The introduction of institutional capital will serve to drive valuations, although that's not the objective. If you actually talk to Roger Goodell, the person who's going to go sell their team for $10 billion, Roger doesn't care about it because he's leaving the league. That person's leaving the league. So what he cares about is the financial stability of the new owner that's coming in and the other 32 teams. That's why there are strict debt limits. That's why they're being really particular about what kind of capital comes in, the structure of the capital. What they really want is a very financially healthy league, and given the value of these franchises and the increasingly limited number of people that can write meaningful equity checks as individuals, bringing that institutional capital actually protects the sanctity of the health of the league.
And so, Brandon, not everybody can write a check to get themselves into either individually or institutionally even into an NFL team. You guys look across a spectrum at a wide variety of teams and leagues. You were very early on in EPL and did some great work there. You know, were first money into the Premier Lacrosse League, you know, back in the US. What are some of the more nascent opportunities for investors who are looking into, especially institutional investors who are looking to get into sports?
Yeah, I mean, look, the hottest topic is probably women's sports right now in general, both in sort of the main core sports that people do, as well as all the ancillary sports that are emerging. Like, I'm personally, I don't know how other people feel, I'm personally a big believer that over time women's sports is going to be huge. I think that's undeniable. I think for institutional capital, the one thing that we struggle with is sort of thinking about the timing of it, right? If you're living inside a fund with a 4 to 5 year horizon, the question is, how quickly does that actually play out? I do think over the last 6 months, you've seen an accelerant there, and I think women's sports is really picking up in terms of viewership, whether it was the NCAA tournament a couple months ago. And so I think you're starting to see those signs, but that I think from an institutional capital perspective is the one thing that we struggle with, is trying to figure out how to play it inside the parameters of a fund. I think I don't have the solution for this, but I've thought about it a little bit, and I think you need different capital solutions for it. You need longer term capital, people that can be patient, or you need vehicles that can provide liquidity where people can trade in and out of it and make a bet that this is the year or this is the next 2 years and play into it. But I think the long-term trends and the success of women's sports is inevitable at this point. It's just a question of timing and when it really does kick in.
Amanda, I want to pick up on something that Brand said just there about sort of the long-dated capital. If you look around this region specifically, you've been deeply involved, in Newcastle specifically. That's a big bet on the part of the Saudis, on the EPL and on football in general. What do institutions bring that is different, in terms of running a club or running a team? What's been your experience there?
Process, and that's important. I think that's a change that we've seen at the EPL over the last few years. And I think institutional, whether it's sovereign wealth fund capital, institutional, it's
Sure.
part of the same bucket. What you're talking about is the combination of individuals versus a corporate. And I think that process is very important. I think we run our businesses, I certainly know from the experience of the Premier League, incredibly professionally. The businesses now have great executives. We have a great executive team that we've put together. And I think all of that process helps. I think, to Brandon's point, I think that funds should be termed out. I think we should see more 10-year, 12-year funds, or some flexibility within fund structures that you can move. One of the big problems with the NFL deal originally was that it was long dated. There was always a pushback against sovereign wealth funds investing in the NFL. We looked, a few years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, at a deal, and it was almost impossible for us to get access to that asset class.
Yeah.
So I think if you put the structure right and work with teams to understand how that capital structure, how the equity works, but also what type of debt structures we can do behind in terms of supportive to those funds, I think it will help liquidity. Because, as professional as our businesses are, there is a lack of liquidity still in certain areas that needs to improve. And there's huge liquidity coming from this region, and it'd be nice to see this region, invest more into the NFL and the US.
Yeah. So Jerry, your experience with AC Milan, I want to talk about that a little bit, because that's been, I saw your chuckle. And actually, for more on AC Milan and Jerry's involvement, you can watch The Deal on Bloomberg, hosted by me and Alex Rodriguez. See, just a little plug for our previous work. When you think about AC Milan and sort of what you've learned so far, my next guest on this stage is going to be Todd Boehly. He'll talk a little bit probably about his baptism by fire into EPL. Like, what have you taken away, especially given your experience doing this for a couple decades now, that's new and different about either that sport or the state of, call it global football?
Look, the answer to the question is everything that we've experienced in the close to 2 years that we've owned AC Milan is pretty much what I knew going in. But, knowing it theoretically and then experiencing it tangibly, there are some differences. I'd say first and foremost, our partner in AC Milan are the fans. And, I take that very seriously. And I say that as an American, because in America, I'd say the owners there don't have the same kind of partnership. Right? And you got to take that seriously in European football, and I do. And you certainly have to take it very seriously in Italy. There is an opportunity here, at least in our investment thesis, to professionalize the way these things are run. And these are, as Greg said, these are not hobbies for rich guys anymore, right? And the reason why you're seeing institutional capital now being attracted to it is because these are multi-billion-dollar live event entertainment businesses, and you got to balance, delivering for the fans. The fans just want to win. The beauty of sports, though, is if you win every time, the irony is that you actually make the league or the competition less interesting. So the human element, the unpredictability of the human element, is what makes these things so valuable. But you always want to be vying for the championship. You always want to be going as far in the competition as possible. And to do that, you have to balance the short-term nature of winning every year versus the long-term sustainability and consistency of lowering the amplitude and the volatility of that performance. And so, these things trade as a multiple of revenue. I think that's lazy. These things should trade as a multiple of cash flow. Right? Cash flow generation is a positive, not a negative. You'll reinvest the cash flow into improving the squad and winning. Yeah. Right? And so it's a virtuous circle. By the way, no different than any other company. It's just that sometimes the emotions get to everybody and it's the here-to moment. Best thing we can do as stewards of this asset for Italy and the fans is to make sure we set it up for long-term success. And obviously we want to win every year. But that's been the really interesting thing. And we haven't really been a control owner of a major sports property before, and so I've been around it, certainly with the Yankees and the Cowboys and the NFL, but that's been the best part of the learning curve.
That's such an interesting point, Greg, that Jerry just brought up, and we were talking about it a little bit backstage, which is sports is just different. I mean, all of you across the stage have worked outside of sports as well, and so there's a playbook of some sort for almost every industry, but sports hits different. I mean, Greg, I've seen you at UFC fights. You worked clearly on that deal with Endeavor and still work with them. How does that emotion, that passion element, how does it change the process by which you do business?
Well, it's that passion that makes it so valuable, without a doubt. And I think if you go back to a macro level as to why all these valuations are increasing and why we're seeing all of this interest in capital in sports, it's been the transformation of the media landscape. And so in the past 10 years, you've had the whole media world go to a streaming world where any entertainment you can watch when you want it, how you want to watch it. You can fast forward through commercials, you can subscribe to it. And so what had been 50 years of an ad-supported media world, that went away, except live sports. Live sports are the one thing you need to watch when it happens or you kind of miss the plot. So you can watch it when it happens, and you can serve ads into it when it happens. So it's become the most valuable media property. And oh, by the way, sports are actually kind of conducive to ads. There's pregame, postgame, halftime, timeouts, stoppage and play. And it's not really interrupting the flow of the programming. And so you know your target audience, you know when they're going to be watching it. And that's why you've seen the media rights of sports go to unbelievable levels. There's speculation around a $76 billion NBA media rights deal. I think as Jerry talked about, what these things really are, an NFL team is super interesting. You own a city, you own the franchise, you can sell tickets, you can sell merchandise, but you really have is 1/32 of the most valuable media property in the world. And it's the passion around that that really drives the interest and drives the ability for advertisers or for tickets or for subscribers or anything else.
No, I was just going to say that the distribution that Greg's talking about, and this is building on what he says, is the globalization of the fan base because everyone has access to the content. So you had the Premier League started playing games in the US, I don't know how long ago it was, 5-7 years ago, and then all of a sudden everyone decided they were a diehard Liverpool fan or whatever. Right. But you have that globalization going on, which is just driving the entire industry. I always joke that 10, 12 years ago, when you go to sell a sports team, if you're selling, the team in Minnesota, you go around, the first thing you do to put together a buyer's list is look at who owns all the car dealerships and who owns all the restaurants in that area. And that has completely changed with the globalization of the fan base and the institutionalization of the money coming in, which has fueled what Jerry would call a bubble, but that's really driven, I think, the valuation of the teams.
And now if you're selling a franchise in Minnesota, you sell it to a former Major League Baseball star. Again, just bringing it back. Just bringing it back. And so, Amanda, it's a really interesting point about the globalization piece of it, especially from a media perspective. I have to think, as you're looking at deals, whether it's Newcastle or golf or whatever it is, it's got to be that sort of global approach. But how feasible is it to really monetize the media landscape globally?
I think we have to be. I think we mustn't be complacent. I think as rights owners, live sport is the most valuable asset, but we've got to make sure we deliver great entertainment. And so I think, as I know from my own personal experience, we try to do everything we can when we get a live game to make sure that we create as much artistry and magic around those games. And whether you're in any different things, the competition for those live rights is going to increase. So I think that the more innovative we can get, then the rights will continue to increase. But I think we have to understand how we're going to deliver those rights in the next 10 years. What's the Premier League going to look like? For instance, we've just finished an international round. We've got other leagues going through their broadcasting rights. And there's going to be a massive step change from the way we deliver and consume rights traditionally now, and how we're going to do that in the next 6, 7 years. And that might take a dip in valuation over a period once we get the infrastructure in place to make sure we can deliver a kind of direct-to-consumer model. And at some point that will happen. And but I think what we understand, and what I loved about what everybody said today, it's the excitement of sport, and live sport is unique, and we got to make sure that we deliver it correctly.
So, Jerry, picking up on that point, you're also in the media business. I think more than reportedly, you've got some interest in a big media asset back in the United States. How do you factor that in? I mean, building on what Amanda is saying, how do you factor media into a valuation when the media world is so uncertain?
Look, this is why it's so difficult to invest in these intellectually property-based assets, because it's very hard for guys like us to underwrite the spreadsheet math. We started the Yes Network with the Yankees in 2001. By 2008, we had taken 3.5 times our money out just through levered recaps. We sold it to Murdoch in 2013 for $4 billion, and then we bought it back as Redbird with the Yankees and Amazon in 2019. So that's almost a 20-year transom. And we started as a growth equity play, and we bought it back as a utility. And the regional sports network model that we kind of pioneered, has now been defeased, and it's probably going to get nationalized by Major League Baseball. But we bought back into it knowing all of that, but we knew what the power of that intellectual property was in the tri-state 9 million person area of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, right? And then again, when you look at NFL games last year, of the top 100 shows on television, 93 were NFL games.
Right.
So you're going to be for some time in this uncomfortable area as the evolution of direct-to-consumer and streaming and technological disintermediation gets absorbed. The one thing I've always said is that I think the death of the cable bundle was greatly exaggerated. What the consumer wants is a value proposition, and linear cable still delivers the best value proposition. Most people aren't going to buy 18 different streaming services. So I never thought ESPN was going down the way everyone else thought. But what you're going to see is the linear model and the direct-to-consumer model coexisting.
Right.
The challenge is, how do you underwrite that mathematically? And it's going to be hard. So you're going to have to make some judgments, which is why I think having longevity, investing in this space is really important, because it's going to require in this transition some judgment calls.
Right. And to ride it out.
Yeah.
Can I ask who do you think should underwrite that point? Do you think the league should underwrite it? Do you think the owners should?
That's a great question. I actually think on the league point, I've suggested somewhat provocatively to the commissioners in the U.S. that the next time there's a media deal up for renewal, they should take 20 cents off the top for the house.
Yep.
And capitalize themselves, because the leagues are, I think, in this transition. And you see, they're the next Disney, right? And Netflix is now looking at getting into live sports programming. The leagues are sitting there with that at their fingertips.
Yep.
Now that's controversial, obviously, because if you're an owner and you've lived for the last few decades with a league that's just a pass-through, you say, well, wait a minute, hold on, you're changing the economic construct. But there is that possibility, and so I think everything should be on the table in terms of this transition and the economic sharing. You're seeing economic sharing with players,
yep.
Right? The players now, at least in golf and in collegiate,
yep.
They now have a seat at the economic table.
Yep.
And I think that's a positive, and I think that's going to continue. But it's going to require some transition. And I think the economic sharing around the media pie is going to need to evolve, and the relationship between leagues and teams is going to have to evolve.
All right, so we only have about 2 minutes left. I want to spend them with Brandon and Greg on one specific question that's going to be the same for each of you, or slightly more or less the same. Brandon, when people come to you and say, I'm interested in buying something in sports, what are they most often looking for?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question because people have all different types of agendas, and so it depends on who's calling. You know, I think most people, if you're talking about uber wealthy people that want to be in the sports business, most people are thinking about teams, right? I think if you think about all of the ecosystem we've been talking about, most people, I think, don't believe that there's an opportunity to invest in or own leagues, which I think is super. You know, it's underlooked and it's super exciting because if you go back to what Jerry was saying, you control the media rights, you kind of control the entire landscape. To me, that's like the holy grail. And then we probably don't have time to get into this, but having focus on teams and leagues, which are the most exciting part, there's a whole world around sports, which I think from our perspective as investors, that's where we tend to focus the most. Like one of our most successful investments was in DraftKings probably 8 or 9 years ago. And we did that because the way that fans were monetized at that time, you literally put the game on television, you showed them some advertising, and that was it. And you have the most engaged fan bases in the world. And it was like, there's so much to do. And that's grown a lot over the last, 8 or 10 years. But like a lot of times we talk to people about figuring out ways to play sports outside of just buying a team.
Right. All right, Greg, last question for you.
Yes. So it's funny, our primary business isn't in sports. But we happen to not be able to get out of the way of doing it given who our client base is. So our whole model is serving family business owners and founders and giving them advice on their businesses, investing in their business with our capital, and allowing them to invest alongside us in our funds. So you've got kind of 220 families in this network. Probably a quarter of them happen to own sports teams. Wow. And so there's so much flow around it. And so when someone comes to us and they're interested in sports, a lot of times it's a pure interest. And so Ryan Smith's a great example. So Ryan Smith sells Qualtrics, has a lot of money. He loves basketball. He's from Utah. He buys the Utah Jazz. It's awesome. Okay, that's great. He's running around doing that. I don't think Ryan Smith's ever been to a hockey game. But Ryan loves Salt Lake and loves Utah, and he wants to make Utah great. And when the Coyotes were kind of going under and playing in a 4,000-seat stadium in Arizona, and Gary Bettman needed a solution, he went to Ryan. And Ryan said, well, I don't really know anything about hockey, but I can make Utah great. And so a lot of the families that in our world that are interested in sports are actually, there's a little bit of a civic duty to it. It's trying to make their city great. And we're now seeing a lot of real estate development around it. So it's an economic opportunity. And so I'd say for the most part, there's a passion in sports, back to your original point. And there's a real desire to try to invest back in their community to make it great.
Guys, I could talk to you all afternoon about this. Thank you so much. An embarrassment of riches on this panel. Jerry, Brandon, Greg, Amanda, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jerry.
And stay tuned for Todd Bowley. All right, see you.
Please welcome to the stage Todd L. Bowley, co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Eldridge Industries.
Sort of cool. I feel like I have my own little talk show up here. I sort of move sets, and then we show a little video about you. It's so great. How you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. It's nice to see you here.
Good to be here.
We talked a couple years ago in Berlin, shortly after you had bought this little football club called Chelsea. And it's been an interesting intervening couple of years. I want to talk about your entire sports portfolio, but I think there might be a run on the stage if I didn't start by asking you about Chelsea. And in the context of what you've been working on in sports over the last 10, 20 years, what's been the biggest lesson? What's been the biggest thing you've taken away from the last 2 years when it comes to Chelsea?
Well, I think the number one thing is you got to be patient. I think you're putting something together and you're expecting it to come together really quickly, and the reality is that anything really good takes a little bit of time. And so I think patience was always thought. I mean, when we bought the Dodgers, and we started the season in 2013, the team basically started 15 and 25.
Yeah.
And, we were struggling, but we kind of just kept sticking to the plan. And, we knew that the plan, or we believed the plan was the right plan at the time. And, we went through a similar thing with Chelsea, and you got to have the resolve to kind of not hear all the noise going on around you. And at the same time, remain patient and committed to the plan.
And you feel good about your plan. I mean, listen, on the pitch, it's been a great little run.
Since Boxing Day, we're the fourth best team in the Premier League.
Right.
So when you look at, what's going on, it feels better and better.
And so how does that influence, winning obviously floats all boats in a lot of ways. What's the next business decision you feel like you need to make with your partners at CFC?
Well, long term, what we're working on is what's the stadium plan going to be. I think we've got, the really unique spot in London. So many people can walk to come to a Chelsea game, and, we're basically in the heart of West London. But, we only have a stadium that seats about 40,000. Mm-hmm. And to be able to upgrade the quality of the stadium and the size of the stadium, is really a priority for us over the course of the next decade.
Right. And you think that'll start pretty soon?
It's already starting.
Yeah.
Right. But, you have to have, a lot of conversations with a lot of constituencies because, you're in the middle of London.
Right.
And, I think the good news is you're in the middle of London, but the bad news is you're in the middle of London.
Right. And so as we zoom out a little bit, it's sort of fascinating. We saw a little bit of it in the video. You think about the Dodgers, the Lakers, Chelsea. These are three, clearly, as an American, certainly the Dodgers and the Lakers, hit bigger in terms of their cultural import. What are the lessons you take from those two franchises? Maybe let's talk about the Dodgers for a second, because, as you say, first blush, tough little run. Now you have arguably the most exciting player maybe to play the game in this century in Shohei Ohtani. How do you maximize him as an asset, I guess, since we are talking business?
Well, I think just to put it in context, like last year, the Rangers played the Diamondbacks in the World Series. And in the aggregate, there was 45 million people that watched that series. When we announced the Ohtani signing at his press conference, there were 70 million people that watched. Wow. When we were in Korea starting the season, the amount of fandom, anytime you go in Tokyo, you see Ohtani. The amount of people who are following, just last night when he hit a home run, he's now batting .361, so he's the #1 batter in the league. And he's hit the second most home runs. And last night when he hit a home run against the San Francisco Giants, the amount of cheering for him, was almost something that you never hear when the Dodgers are in San Francisco.
Right.
And that's because people travel to see him. He is every city, you have this new fan base that's really focused on all things Ohtani.
Right. And so what does that mean for the franchise, and what are the business decisions that you make, and how does that influence other decisions you make having this person? Especially the structure of the deal allows for more spending in the interim, right? In terms of the way you structured his massive contract, right?
Well, obviously he was excited about that.
Yeah.
Right? Because what he really wanted from us was a commitment to win on the field. And, for people who don't know, basically it's the largest sports contract, in the world. The notional amount was $700 million. And it's a 10-year playing contract with a 20-year payout. So for the first 10 years, he makes $2 million a year. And for years 11 through 20, he made $68 million a year. Right? So basically, when you think about what the average annual value of that is, it's roughly $44 million a year. And he did that because he wanted us to be able to invest in the team and win now. So that allowed us to go get, a couple other pitchers because we had the financial flexibility to do it. But obviously you've got, a pitcher and a hitter in Ohtani. So you got a top 5 hitter in the world, you've got a top 5 pitcher in the world, and you get an extra roster spot out of it.
Right.
Right. So, most people are playing with 25 people, we're playing with 26.
Right. And so as you think about, the lessons of the Dodgers, how do you apply that? I mean, whether it's the long-term investment thesis, like how does that play out across the rest of the portfolio?
Well, the first thing I think, from our point of view, we believe the brands really matter. And, if you look at the Dodgers, in the U.S., it's a giant brand. They were the first team to have an African-American player in Jackie Robinson. And then, of course, I would argue that the Lakers in the 80s with the Celtics really built the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
Both the Lakers and the Celtics each have 17 titles. So, those are the two dominant teams. And back in the 80s when the NBA was really kind of getting going, because before that, there was questions whether the NBA would survive.
Yeah.
And you had Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird, still the most watched NCAA finals game in the history of NCAA basketball, college basketball. And those two guys came into the league at the right time, and really built both brands.
Right.
And so I think from our perspective, it's really hard to recreate a brand. It's really hard to extend a brand, from one level into another level. So, the brands that are the Lakers and Dodgers and Chelsea, they're global brands.
Right.
And that's just really hard to replicate.
And so what do you need to do to further the Chelsea global brand? Because, obviously it is a global brand, but probably trails some of its rivals in the EPL. Where do you need to invest there to ensure that it continues to grow?
Well, I think, as you said earlier, winning is clearly the most important thing. So we're focused on winning. The second thing is having what we think is a really young and exciting team.
Right.
That's going to be around together for a long time. Because if you look at franchises that, dominate for periods of time, it's because they have real stability in the team, real stability in the front office, real stability in, the coaching. So, to be able to lay the groundwork, to be able to start with the stability on the team, by having a young team that has, longer than average contracts. And the reality is in European football, if you're a 7-year contract, the way we look at that is really it's a 5-year contract, right? Because, the capitalization of the transfer value is such that you're never going to let a contract expire down to the last year.
Right.
You're either going to extend the contract or you're going to figure out, what's next, for that player. So, when we were looking at that, we're thinking a lot about how do we have stability, how do we have a core, and the Dodgers are the same thing. Right now, if you look at our top 3 players in the lineup, right, you've got Mookie Betts, who we signed to a 10-year contract. We've got Shohei Ohtani batting second, who is also on a 10-year contract, and we got Freddie Freeman, who's on an 8-year contract. So, the duration that we have for those guys to develop together, is really what we think makes, the potential. Obviously, it doesn't guarantee anything.
Right.
But it's laying the framework for the foundation for something that has the ability to come together as it, figures itself out.
Right. And is that a story that you feel like that is starting to get through on the Chelsea side? Because, let's be honest, taking a lot of heat, and I know you probably isolate yourself from a lot of the noise, but like for the spending. But you look at that as an investment. That's the other thing I don't
think, right? When people talk about spending, the way I think about it is we're investing, and when we have a collection of players, and really those players continue to hold their value.
Right.
Right. So it's not as if we're kind of writing off the money. the investment, right? So, what we're thinking about is what does it really cost to finance that portfolio of players?
Yeah.
Right? So, because of course, some players will go up in value and some players will go down in value. But, I would argue that, the investments that we've made, have continued to, as a balance, continue to hold their value. And really, therefore, we're not spending the money, we're investing the money. And really, we're just thinking about the cost to carry.
Yeah.
What's it cost to carry that portfolio of players that are obviously so valuable?
I want to widen the aperture even more and still stay in this topic to talk about media, because you have assets there as well through Eldridge, whether it's with Rolling Stone, Golden Globes, A24, obviously in the movie business, Cirque du Soleil. You understand the media world. The media world is part of the intrinsic value. We just spent a lot of time talking about this on the panel in sports. How do you see the media element of this evolving in the near term? We've got an NBA, media rights deal that's going to be announced probably any day now. What happens next with media as it relates to sports and the value of sports?
So, right, if you think about how you break apart the value of a club or a team, right, you have everything that goes on site, right? You've got the tickets, the merch, the hospitality, the food and beverage, the sponsorship inside of the actual facility. And then, the media value is the glow, right, that comes out of the facility, whether it's an arena or a stadium or whatever it is. And then you think about, okay, well, how do I expand and extend that glow, right? And I think obviously, the thing that really is driving these is that there's now trillion-dollar balance sheets or trillion-dollar market value companies that have gotten involved, right? So it used to be you would have kind of the broadcasters thinking about it. Now you've got Amazon, Google, Apple that are all playing in the game. And you look at them, and together they're probably worth, I don't know, $6 trillion or something, $5 trillion.
And not to mention Netflix, who's probably around the hoop.
Yeah, and Netflix is, it's a big company.
Yeah.
But compared to those guys, it's really not so big. Right. But it's, I think, probably a $300 billion market cap.
Right.
And now they're throwing their hat in the ring, because they understand, that people want to watch this stuff. And, there's very few things that people will adjust their calendar for, right? So, and sports are probably it.
Right.
Maybe some award shows, but certainly sports.
Right. And if you look at, Major League Baseball, it is a tale of the haves and have-nots in many ways when it comes to media. The Dodgers, that was a key part of your investment thesis, I believe, when you bought the Dodgers, is the sort of implicit value on the media side, correct?
100%.
Yeah.
When we bought the club, it was 2012, and the media rights were coming up for renewal in 2013, right? So, and how we valued that was a real appreciation for what we thought the media rights were, right? And, MLB is even more complicated, right? Because you've got the cable system. Back then, it's now kind of crumbling a little bit, but you have the cable system that would then go into the RSN, and then the dollars in the RSN would go into the team, right? And the dollars that would stay at the RSN were not subject to revenue sharing.
Right.
So, the revenue sharing is really what goes on at the team, but not at the RSN. So we ended up getting $8.4 billion over 25 years that went from the cable companies into the RSN, and we only had to invest $3 billion from the RSN into the team.
Right.
Roughly, rough math.
Right.
Right, so that was absolutely part of the strategy. And, the revenue sharing was based on the $3 billion, roughly, that was coming from the RSN into the team, and everything that stayed in the RSN, and we owned 100% of the RSN.
And so does the same upside exist as you look at Chelsea and the EPL and soccer more globally? Does the same upside exist for media, you think, for soccer?
Football, yeah. I think that it's hard to be here and call it soccer.
I know. But it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for me.
But I think there's no bigger sport in the world in terms of demand, right? And you go anywhere in the world and people know the top football clubs, And, even in the U.S., I think the time slots that the Premier League has, in the U.S. on Saturday and Sunday doesn't really compete with anything.
Right.
Right, and obviously the NFL is trying to figure out how do I do more games in London and Munich and places like that, because of course that works really well for them, because then you wake up and you have, breakfast with the NFL.
Right.
But that's every week, with the Premier League.
Right.
Right, is the Saturday morning time zone, in the East Coast at least, and a little bit earlier on the West Coast. But yeah, I think that, because there's so much implicit demand, so what you have to figure out how to do is how do you get direct relationships with your fan bases?
Right.
Right, and how do you do things that, are unique and different? But obviously what we have is an asset in Chelsea that, is in high demand.
Right.
Right, and we can give experiences that, you just can't buy elsewhere. So how do we start to think about, how to, position, those opportunities in order to really grow revenue, in a world where, financial fair play is becoming, a much more, detailed conversation, and I think something that, the league is committed to in order to try to, have a more balanced, competitive slate.
Right. And do you think financial fair play is at the place it needs? What else needs to happen to ensure that there actually is fair play?
Well, it's coming. I mean, I think you're seeing, a lot of debate about, what percentage of revenue can be spent on the team, and that's happening, and likely to be, voted on in the June Premier League meeting and finalized. And then there's another concept that, if you think about one is top down and one is bottom up, there's another concept called anchoring, which is saying that, the maximum wages for the team can only be a certain multiple of the smallest amount of media money that goes to, the 20th Premier League team.
Right. And so as you look at this portfolio, we only have a couple minutes left, and I could talk to you all afternoon about this, but as you look at your portfolio now, you do have some unbelievable assets. You also have this, massive business and credit, et cetera, that you also have to, that I have not asked you anything about because we're talking about sports, which is sort of your burden and opportunity. This is the life you've chosen. But do you see other opportunities in sports? The NFL is, about to open to institutional investors. I imagine you've looked at the NFL before. Are there startup leagues? Are there other things that at least tickle your brain as an opportunity in sports?
Oh, I think there's just so many adjacencies. Yeah. And, I was an early investor in DraftKings, and, you start to see how, that continues to develop. And, I think, there's a lot of debate right now going on as to, is gambling, good for the game?
Right.
Or games, and I would argue that there was always gambling. And whether it was in the black market or in the legal market, I think it's much better in the legal market. And I think what you've seen this year is, you can see the sports radars of the world can see when there's someone crowding a specific bet.
Right.
Right. So there was a situation with one of the players on one of the NBA teams, where they basically were doing prop bets on how many minutes they were going to play. And, there was an incident where, he basically pulled himself out of the game, because he had a contact lens issue, but then Sports Radar basically said, well, why is everyone betting that this no-name player, is going to be playing less than 4 minutes? I can't remember what it was. And they immediately identified it.
Yeah.
Right. So, I think that, because now it's basically like a real market, right, where people see where the flows are going, and so when strange things are happening, you can respond really quickly.
Right.
So I think we're just getting started at how that's going to really protect the integrity of the game, versus in the old scandals, it was all done in the black market.
Right. I'm going over time just to ask you this one last question. Women's sports came up on the panel previously. feels like there's investment happening at Chelsea specifically on the women's side in terms of the opportunity there. Is that something you're interested in broadly?
I learned about that reading about it in the
Okay.
paper. So, it's amazing how many things I learn about reading about. So.
But in terms of the opportunity for women's sports, is that something you see in general?
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously, the Caitlin Clark phenomenon has been nothing short of just amazing, right?
Right.
The men's Final Four had a lower media audience than the women's Final Four this year.
Right.
And that was Caitlin Clark, and she played her first game last night and proved that she deserves to be in the WNBA, scored 20 points in her first game. And I think it's just getting started. You're going to see the WNBA continue to grow. You're going to see women's soccer, football around the world, the NWSL.
Right.
Angel City is talked about being up for sale. So, I would be shocked if that, doesn't go for at least $200 million.
Right.
And who would have thought, a year or 2 years ago, when the Washington Spirit just traded for $33 million or something, that you're going to see, the Angel Cities club trade for 200.
Right.
And, I think one of the things we believe very much, is that the Chelsea's women's team is a top women's team in the world, and is going to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And we're starting to see sponsors recognize the fact that, they got to get on board.
Right.
Because, it's good for their brand.
Right. You're a gentleman for spending time with me. Thank you so much. Really good to see you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks.
Please welcome to the stage Jim Messina, CEO of the Messina Group, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Mark Miller.
We're all that's standing between them and some refreshments outside. So let's get started. It's fitting that we're following Todd Boehly because you have become a recent co-owner of a team, Leeds United, I believe.
Yes, go Leeds, go.
And you have a playoff game coming up tomorrow, right?
Tomorrow.
Who do you play?
We play Norwich City in the championship playoffs.
But you're going to miss it.
I'm going to miss it because I'm going to be on a plane. So if you're on Air Qatar, please make sure that the Wi-Fi works tomorrow.
Right. So let's set the context for our discussion here. There was a New York Times Siena College poll that came out last week that showed that Joe Biden is behind Donald Trump in 5 of 6 key, what we call battleground states that are all absolutely critical for him to win re-election. Not all, but there's a narrow path, right?
That's right.
So he won all 6 of these in 2020, and now he's behind in 5 of them, some quite substantially. In Nevada, Trump is at 50%, Biden 38%. Georgia, 49% for Trump, Biden 39%. Pennsylvania, key state, Trump is ahead 47% to Biden's 44%. And the surveys of the discussions with voters around those results show that it's cost of living, inflation, immigration concerns, Gaza, and a general kind of desire for change that are hurting Biden. So given all of that, how worried are you? How panicked are you about what's going to happen in November to the Democratic nominee?
Well, look, I'm not that worried, in part, because when I ran President Obama's campaign, what you realize is the hardest part are the polls, the daily back and forth, and usually the incumbent trails. At this exact day, Barack Obama trailed, Donald Trump trailed when he lost, George Bush trailed. Incumbents around the world are not popular right now.
Right.
So I'm not as worried, and I also think when you look at the polls, I used to tell people in the Obama campaign, if you talk to me about a poll, I will fire you. Because we're 174 days out. Why do you care about polls? Now, I'm not saying that the polls are great for the president, because they're not. But when you look at what Joe Biden needs to do to win, it really is giving a very direct contrast. How he beat Trump the first time was being very clear on what Joe Biden would do and what Donald Trump would do. And that contrast has not yet been made. Trump came through his primary sailing through. Voters haven't started focusing on him yet. And so all that's going to happen. And I think even in the last month, you've seen the tightening of the polls. Not that I look, Mark, because I don't.
Right.
But, I just don't think, you can look at the polls. The other thing is, in the United States, we had this massively controversial Supreme Court decision about abortion.
Right.
And since that case, Democrats have done 9% better than the polls because a whole lot of Republican women are now voting for Democrats in these local elections. Democrats have just swept up around the country since that thing. And I don't think that's factored in the polls as well. That said, this is not a wonderful time to be an incumbent. I'm advising several candidates around the world in their presidential elections, and you'd rather be the challenger than you would the incumbent right now for a variety of reasons that you and I will talk about.
Right. And just for context, Jim managed the campaign of the last Democratic president to win re-election, which of course was Barack Obama. And as you say, there were challenging moments in the Obama campaign, but wasn't he consistently ahead for most of it, except for maybe a period in October?
We trailed until June.
Okay.
And then Romney
and the nominee at that point was Mitt Romney.
Mitt Romney, who now seems like a completely normal human who'd be very different than President Trump. And at the time was an incredibly difficult opponent. And we trailed him the entire spring and took the lead in the summer, and then held on to win.
Right. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into what we might think could be the reasons why that the president is trailing so badly. To me, one of the most interesting dichotomies in this race is, by many indicators, Biden's economic record is actually pretty good.
Yep.
I mean, even after adjusting for inflation, U.S. GDP is up 7% since early 2020. The stock market has hit record levels. U.S. unemployment is at or near historic lows. He has passed multiple ambitious pieces of legislation with a very difficult Congress situation to work with, but the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, which is about manufacturing chips in the United States, bipartisan infrastructure bill. Huge amounts of money are now pouring into these infrastructure projects in the United States, semiconductor manufacturing, against a backdrop of Donald Trump on trial in New York in a fairly tawdry case. So how
I like your framing of the election.
And yet we see Donald Trump leading consistently in the polls. So how do you explain what's going on?
Well, look, I think a couple things. American elections are economic elections, usually. When I was running Obama's campaign at 2 o'clock in the morning every month, Bill Clinton would call me up in the middle of the night and say to me, all presidential elections are always a referendum on the economic future of the country.
Right.
Mark, this might be the first election where that's not true.
You think?
It could be, because if you look at the campaigns both parties are running, and I'm not involved in either campaign, and I can talk about it on TV and be happy about it, so I'm not being partisan here, but Democrats are talking about abortion, Republicans are talking about immigration, both sides are trying to get into the economic issues. Voters, a reminder that America is now the most partisan country in the world. Only about 8% of Americans could vote for both Trump and Biden. 92% have already decided who they're voting for.
Right.
So we're competing over a very small group of people. And right now, the view with those voters is that Trump is better on the economy. And so Biden's challenge is to catch up on that economic number and basically get to parity. This will also be the first election in American political history where neither candidate gets to 50% approval rating. Barack Obama got to 50% in October of 2012, and I knew we had the election won, because 50% was enough.
Right.
Neither one of these guys is going to get to 50. Neither one of these guys is going to get to 45.
Right.
So what does that mean? That means that between 15 and 20% of Americans are going to vote for someone they don't like. And those double doubters, I call them, double haters, other people call them, are going to have to vote for someone that they don't approve of. And that leads into the other reason I think the polls are garbage, is because for the first time in 30 years in the US, we're going to have a big third-party candidate.
Right.
And the third-party candidate, there's a couple of them, but they're now taking votes away for that exact demographic, those double hater people I talked about. Joe Biden won those voters by 12 points. They basically gave him the presidency. And right now, that's the exact demographic where Kennedy is doing the best.
Right.
And so,
That's Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yes. The Kennedys will be around in American politics forever.
Right. Even one who's been denounced by the rest of
the entire family. The entire family.
Right. So this, you touched on this just a few minutes ago. This is not a phenomena unique to Joe Biden.
No.
As we know, almost 50% of the world's population has or will be voting in national elections this year. And many, as you say, incumbents are deeply unpopular. According to some polls, every leader of a group of 7 nations has a higher disapproval rating than an approval rating, which I think is fascinating. Now, you and your firm work on political campaigns and advise governments all over the world. What do you think is driving such deep levels of discontent?
2 things. In a post-COVID economic world, let's be honest, voters, it's tough out there for people. And this is the first generation, at least in America, where voters no longer believe that their kids' generation is going to be better than theirs. The American dream that we always talked about, voters aren't sure it's there. That is true all over the place. And what we're seeing in world politics is migration has become the biggest issue in world politics. You saw right-wing governments win a stunning election that no poll showed in the Netherlands a couple months ago. You're seeing rising of extremism on the left and the right. Major parties in Europe, Latin America, and Asia are going down. 3rd and 4th and 5th political parties are going up. There's real anger out there that what you and I would have considered to be fringe candidates are tapping into, and Mark, they're winning elections.
Right.
Winning elections of people, AMLO in Mexico wasn't part of a party, Wilders in Netherlands, Milei in Argentina, Italy. Those people are winning these elections now. And it's partially because of immigration. It's a lot about economic dislocation, and they're not sure what the future is. And then some of it, honestly, is our bifurcated social media. When I was coming up in politics, I was taught, you control the narrative, you win the campaign. In the age of social media, it is really hard to control a narrative.
Right.
We used to talk about the bully pulpit in American politics. The president went out and gave a speech and defined the message. And that's just not true anymore. And so it makes it really hard to get out to voters what you're doing. And to your point, incumbents are struggling with this all over the world. And that's true here this week in my meetings. Governments around the world are trying to figure out how to talk to citizens in a new way. What are the technologies you use? How do you tell people what you're doing? And I think that stuff is changing a lot.
Right. I mean, when Joe Biden was elected in 2020, TikTok, did it exist?
I think it had just started, but no one knew what it was.
But no one knew what it was.
Right. And this election will be what I call the TikTok election.
Right.
The most used platform in America for political discourse is TikTok. And, that didn't even exist. Barack Obama won a presidency with Facebook. I remember on election night 2008, we sent out one tweet for the Obama campaign because we thought it was a stupid technology that would never go anywhere. And 4 years later, we used it every day. And, so people say, Jim, what's your advice? And my advice is data matters. Having big data, there are many platforms, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, text, TV, but what you need is data. And that's true in our corporate work too. You need to figure out how to target the right consumers, target the right voters. And I think it'll be interesting to see how both campaigns are really doing that.
But as a student of political history in the US and elsewhere, how do you see the future when you touched on migration? climate change is obviously driving some of this migration patterns because it's causing conflict. People are trying to leave conflict. It will change the economic conditions, the ability of people to earn money in ways that I think will be profound. Technology is, that's fueled this rise of populism. Technology kind of turbocharges everything.
Yep.
Are we in a cycle that is going to continue, where essentially things just get worse and worse? Well,
God,
why should I not be depressed about the state of the world?
let me make you a little calmer. So at heart, I'm an optimist. And I believe when you look at the overall trends, the trend lines are good. More people around the world are getting education, less people in poverty. Bill Gates gives this great speech about, if you look at the data, there's never been a better time to be alive than right now. Sure. And you and I know from your history in journalism and mine in politics that we've been through this before. We went through this in the muckraker days in the 1920s. We had great strife in the 50s and 60s during the social movements. We've been through the Vietnam War. We went through that and came out the other side. I think in the end, probably technology, which I agree with you, is probably the cause of some of this, is probably going to be the thing that fixes it too. We have amazing innovation going on. Yesterday I toured or talked to folks here who are building the first large language model in Arabic in Doha.
Fascinating.
They'll find new ways to communicate with people. They'll do really cool things. There's a lot of experiments right now going on the ground. It's making people start to have different kinds of conversations. And so I think we'll iterate out of this. Is it bumpy right now? Absolutely. But am I inherently an optimist that the arc of history is getting better? I think that's what the data says. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us. You're in this room at 4 o'clock, separated from getting a cold drink, hearing me talk because you care about these issues. And 2 billion people around the world are going to vote this year, over 70 countries. This will be the biggest year for democracy ever. And that just has to make me optimistic.
One of the things that occurs to me about social media, and particularly in the TikTok age, is that it kind of erases any sense of history. So, for example, Biden seems to be losing support among younger voters in many cases because of his support of Israel in its war in Gaza. That's prompted a huge number of demonstrations, I think, as we all know, on American college campuses, for example. But his opponent, Donald Trump, tried to implement a ban on Muslims from many countries and is arguably a much stronger supporter of Bibi Netanyahu than Biden is. So how do you explain this kind of amnesia, and amnesia about kind of what the Donald Trump presidency was like for many people?
So I used to say to President Obama almost every day, if this election is a choice between you and your opponent, you will win. If it's a referendum on the incumbents usually lose because of the numbers you and I talked about. The Biden campaign has not yet and is starting to drive that contrast. You have the best example, which is under 5% of young voters know that Donald Trump favors a ban on Muslims. What campaigns do is tell people about that. We are in an age of cynicism about politics, cynicism about life, and you feel that on social media. You see that every day. And it's why my advice to campaigns all the time is get surrogates, get people who look like voters, who talk like voters, who are their age, just start pointing some of this out. Is, an 80-year-old Joe Biden really going to do a TikTok and say, let me tell you, 18-year-old, why to vote? Probably not. Right. But if Taylor Swift did it, that's a much different thing. If Beyonce did it, if local young people who are influencers do it. And so I think it just goes back to what you and I were talking about. Using the medium to get your message out, I think is really, really important, and driving that contrast. Both campaigns have got to figure out how to make it more about the other candidate. And once that contrast happens, because if you just look at the actual numbers, Joe Biden should be doing much better with younger voters. Since the Dobbs decision, Donald Trump should be doing much better with women voters, and his numbers have gone down. So they both have got to figure out what to do to drive those contrasts.
So I know you are a major Swiftie.
I am a Swiftie.
Do you think there's a chance that she might be persuaded to endorse Donald Trump?
Well,
Joe Biden.
Well, she's already.
Would you advise that?
Well, I would beg her to do it.
Her to do
yes,
it, right.
yes. I would offer to be her staffer for free if she would do it, and I'm very expensive. So, like, no, I'm kidding. I think she's already taken some steps. She just did a rally in the Midwestern states, and she registered over 40,000 voters in one concert. That is a very big deal.
Right.
She has been involved in politics before. What she will do, that's her decision. But, Barack Obama won in part because of the amazing surrogates who campaigned for him. You could argue that the most powerful endorsement he got was Oprah.
Right.
When no one thought Barack Obama could win, Oprah endorsed him. And that was the beginning of kind of saying, oh my God, this guy could win. So, I know we joke about Taylor, but these surrogates in this age of cynicism really do matter. And when you ask people, how they're thinking about what to vote, they literally say, like, what are other people doing? What are my friends and family doing? And it's important to run a campaign that reflects that.
Your firm, the Messina Group, recently took a stake in another advisory group, which is called Global Counsel. It has offices in many places around the world, including here in Doha.
Yep.
Right? So how are you advising these different clients around the world to think about how they should cope with the challenges that we've just been talking about around migration, technology, et cetera? Is there some common theme to how you approach the advice that you're giving those clients?
Yeah, especially in the kind of corporate sector with our corporate clients. Why I'm in Doha because we just made this investment in Global Counsel, in my opinion, the best firm in Europe and the Middle East. In part, I did it because I think the next decade for companies will be decided on this line of where regulation hits innovation. And you all know this in this room, governments are going to regulate, governments are going to help, governments are going to hurt, governments are going to be a part of our future because of things like migration, climate change, economic development. And so you need a trusted partner. And I want to build a worldwide practice that can say to, Mark, the CEO of Markco, like, you have problems all over the world, I can help you everywhere. And here's why, because, you don't want help in one place or the other place. You want someone who can sit with you and say, how do you deal with social media? How do you deal with data? How do you deal with governments? And so that's the kind of work we're going to do with Global Counsel. And, in my time here with the staff and talking to all the amazing leaders that are at this conference, people want to work together. People understand that this is a connected world, right, and we all have to take these challenges on together.
So let's go back to where we started this conversation. Who will be the next president of the United States?
So my prediction, I'm not going to dodge, but I'm going to tell you this is going to be the closest election in American history. We didn't know for several days last time. I think we're likely going to be closer. Remember that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in the closest 3 states by 70,000 votes. Biden beat Trump in the closest 3 states by about 250,000 votes.
Right.
It is likely going to be even closer than that because of the third parties we talked about. If I was playing poker, I think you'd rather nominally have Biden's cards than you would Trump's cards. Just given the swing states, it's probably easier for Biden to win Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, which gets him enough to win it all, than it is for Trump to win those states. But it's going to be incredibly close. And that's true in all the races we're working on around the world. It's just, we are divided right now and we're going through a tough time. But I think we'll innovate out of it. And, we'll be watching in 174 days to see who the President of the United States of America is.
That is a bit of a dodge, but I'll let you get away with it. All right, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
for staying till the end. We hope you found today's conversations insightful. We'd like to thank our official partners, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry of the State of Qatar and Media City Qatar, our innovation sponsor QRDI, and our premier sponsors Qatar Investment Authority and QNB. Thank you all to our other sponsors for making the forum possible. Now we wrap up main stage sessions for today, but the program continues. Our breakout sessions in the Fairmont Hotel. Please make your way to the breakout stage, and we'll see you here tomorrow for our last day at the Qatar Economic Forum. Thank you.